Disturbing things had been happening on the 5th floor of the Rose Heights apartment building in Albany, New York. Residents had reported strange noises over the last few days, screaming in the night, pained muttering, soft weeping, scratching and scuttling in the walls, and worst of all, what seemed like an infestation of bugs unlike anything the unfortunate occupants of Rose Heights had ever seen before. They weren't abnormal in size or shape. They looked an awful lot like the common earwig, around 2.5 centimeters long with large curved pinchers on the back. But the color wasn't right. Unlike the usual dark brown, these earwigs were a silvery, almost translucent gray. When people spotted them crawling across their walls or hiding in the carpet, they seemed to shimmer in the light. Eventually, the building's landlady, Donna Tompkins, was called in to do something about the infestation. She spoke to each of the residents about their experience. They reported the strange noises, the mysterious bugs, and even a funny smell they'd sometimes catch in the hall, a smell like someone had thrown up. And every single person that Donna spoke to couldn't help but remark that the smell was particularly strong outside the apartment of a certain resident, Bill Parham. Stranger still was the fact that Bill hadn't been seen in days. Donna knocked on his door, but received no answer. She called him on his cell phone and could hear the phone ringing inside the apartment, but it just went to voicemail. When she checked the security footage of the lobby, she saw that Bill hadn't left the building in the last few days either. Donna called the police, worried that Bill might be sick or even dead inside his apartment. It was strange, given that he was only in his 30s and didn't seem to have any health conditions. But stranger things had happened. Much stranger things were about to happen too. 2 police officers arrived not long after. They called through the door one more time, and when they got no response, Donna gave them the key to head inside. The apartment was a wreck. All the furniture was covered in dust. Filthy dishes were piled high in the sink and on the draining board. The smell of rot was thick in the air. There were empty boxes of painkillers, all the pills popped from their silvery foil laying on the ground. But worst of all were the bugs. The apartment was crawling with them, and they were on every surface. Those silvery gray earwigs. Neither of the officers liked bugs, and it seemed like the deeper they got into the apartment, the more bugs there were. Some even seemed to be crawling towards them, pointing their pinchers at them as though they were defending their territory. This looked to be a textbook case of what happens when a resident keels over and dies. But there was just one problem. Where was the body? Bill Parham had seemingly dropped off the face of the earth, and now a colony of mysterious bugs had started squatting in his apartment in his absence. Then came that smell again, that truly awful smell, like bile and blood. It was even stronger now, and it seemed like it was coming from a nearby closet. The 2 officers, acting on pure instinct, drew their weapons and approached the closet with caution. Even if they weren't consciously aware of it, they knew they were going to find something awful inside. Something evil. Something dangerous. When they threw open the closet door, they couldn't help but scream. They'd found the nest. It was a huge round hive, like the biggest beehive you've ever seen, melded into the lower corner of the closet. The unnatural earwigs were crawling into, out of, and around it. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands of them. And the second they registered the presence of the 2 officers, intruders into their nest, they began to swarm. In sheer panic, both raised their guns and opened fire into the closet, but it didn't do them any good. Their bullets just pierced and splintered the hive, causing even more enraged insects to spill out and begin crawling over the 2 cops. They fled from the apartment, screaming in pain from the gnashing pincers of the insects crawling all over their skin. They never did find the corpse of Bill Parham, but that's because Bill Parham wasn't dead, at least not until mere moments ago, when the bullets from the cops' gun had torn through his bones and perforated his organs. He died not long after, and if he could still speak close to the end, he would have thanked them both for the mercy because the monstrosity that they just encountered in the closet wasn't just a nest of mysterious insects in Bill Parham's apartment. It was Bill himself. This is the fate worse than death in store for anyone supremely unlucky enough to fall victim to SCP-439, better known by the nickname for their unique nests, the Bone Hive. And while these nasty little critters may be small, they're filled with enough pure nightmare fuel to send you running into 682's containment chamber for a little comfort. Let's go through this whole nightmarish process and tell you exactly what happened to poor Bill Parham. First discovered by the SCP Foundation in mainland China, SCP-439 specimens largely get by on the fact that they're not much to look at. Unless you're an entomologist, when you see a strange insect, you probably just accept the fact that it's a perfectly normal breed you've just never encountered before. Nobody is hammering down the doors of their local news station to alert the press about the gray earwig they saw crawling out of a crack in their bathroom wall. But if Bill Parham had done just that, it would have saved his life. The Foundation would have immediately flagged the incident as an SCP-439 infestation and dispatched a mobile task force to deal with it. Instead, when Bill saw the earwig for the first time, he was getting ready for work and didn't have the time to stop and deal with it. He made a mental note to buy some bug killer on the way home, but quickly forgot. The insect didn't forget him though. In fact, it thought he would be a perfect candidate for the SCP-439 process. The Foundation has tested extensively with the one SCP-439 sample they'd been able to successfully catch and contain. In all tests, they found that 439 specimens rejected hosts from any species other than humans. They're an extraordinarily specific parasite. It's also only one particular type of SCP-439 specimen that you actually need to worry about: the queens. Despite their superficial similarities, SCP-439 behave nothing like non-anomalous earwigs. Normal earwigs are not social creatures. They're solitary scavengers and they don't keep nests as permanent habitats. The same can definitely not be said for SCP-439. They have complex social structures, much like that of bees, ants, and termites, with queens, scouts, workers, and warriors. If you happen to encounter a worker or a warrior, you may get a painful pinch from their pinchers if you get too close. But if you end up on the wrong side of one of the queens, then you have a much worse fate in store for you. And it just so happened that the SCP-439 specimen that appeared in Bill Parham's bathroom that morning was visiting royalty. This 439 queen had selected her target, and now it was time to move to the next part of the process: initial infiltration. When Bill returned home from work, he was delighted to find that the gray earwig was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't mean it was gone. It was still there lurking. It just didn't want to be seen. After all, the real fun would happen after Bill went to bed. Once SCP-439 detects that its potential host has fallen into a deep sleep, it will crawl onto the person's body and into their mouth, which is exactly what it did to Bill. It feels like little more than a tickle in your throat, and you will have no idea that the tiny creature crawling down your windpipe and into the soft, warm tissue of your lungs spells your doom. Very few people wake up during this process, but even if they did, there's virtually nothing they could do. When Bill woke up, he was suffering from mild chest pains and shortness of breath, a symptom not uncommon in a number of respiratory ailments. He had no idea that the SCP-439 queen was already inside him. He got up and went about his day, trying to ignore the pain as it gradually grew worse and worse, feeling almost like something was moving inside his chest. He spent the whole day having to stop to let out a deep, hacking cough, but coughing didn't expel or change anything. He looked and felt so terrible that his boss let him go home early, hoping that Bill would be able to sleep off whatever illness he thought he had picked up. But over the next couple of days, his condition only worsened. The pain grew so excruciating he could barely move, and he was popping painkillers like Tic Tacs to no effect. He started running a dangerously high fever, his body trying in vain to fight back against its lethal intruder. He felt worse than he ever had in his life, but little did poor Bill know, the most terrible parts of the process were yet to come. Through anomalous means, an SCP-439 infection is able to induce fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP, in its victims, which is typically a genetic disease that presents itself before the victim turns 10 years old. The condition is infamous for its primary symptom, turning muscle and other soft tissue into bone, slowly but surely paralyzing the victim and putting them into a state of unspeakable pain. This bone transformation process is known as ossification, and Bill was about to experience it firsthand. His pain increased as his mobility decreased, with more of his flesh becoming solid lumps of bone underneath the skin. Soon enough, all he knew was pain. It had become so agonizing that he was delirious with it. He was drunk on pain. Even perceiving sunlight felt like being stabbed in the eyes. That's why, like all the other victims of SCP-439, he decided to conceal himself in a warm, dark place where no light could get to him. In Bill's case, of course, that place was his closet. He was hurting so bad that all he could do was curl up into the fetal position and weep as his muscles turned to bone and his body began to compact and shrink. He didn't even look like a human anymore. He was more like a ball, covered in a bone shell and filled with warm organs. That's when the queen started laying eggs among his organs. It wasn't long before there was a new brood of around 30,000 specimens living inside Bill's body. He was still very much alive, but there wasn't anything he could do about his situation. His muscles had long since turned to bone, and they had eaten large portions of his brain, leaving mainly the parts needed to keep his organs just barely functioning. After all, the colony still needs central heating. SCP-439 colonies have developed a perfect parasitic relationship with the human body. They even use the stomach inside the hive to pre-digest food into a liquid slurry that's easier for them to consume. The only loser in this situation is someone like Bill, who is forced to become the new home for the world's most nightmarish freeloaders. Eventually, when the colony becomes too big, a queen departs to start a new one, and the process repeats itself once more. It's enough to make you want to sleep with your mouth closed for the rest of your life. Oh, and we haven't even told you the worst part yet. Foundation scientists have conducted tests on some victims of SCP-439 and found that while the creatures do consume large parts of the brain, the parts they leave are capable of consciousness. That's right. Their victims remain aware of what's happening to them the whole time, even when they hardly seem human at all anymore. What actually finally kills the victims of SCP-439 isn't the bodily trauma. It's the starvation that sets in when the colony inevitably moves on. Did we just hear you cough? You might want to go get that checked out. It's the holiday season. Outside it's cold and there's snow blanketing the ground, but inside you're warm and gathered around the light of a roaring fireplace and a glowing Christmas tree. This is what Christmas is all about: warmth, joy, and togetherness. But just because you're comfortable doesn't mean you're safe. You were so busy opening presents and stuffing yourself at dinner that you didn't notice the face pressed up against the window. That long, gaunt face with the staring eyes, the wide mouth full of yellow teeth, and the scraggly white beard. You don't know it yet, but within a few days, you'll be dead. You might be able to avert this horrible fate if you knew what exactly you were dealing with. SCP-2086, also known as the Yule Man, a Keter-class Christmas monster so violent, sadistic, and terrifying, he makes Krampus look like Jolly Saint Nick. And this year, just like every other, he's planning on being very, very naughty. The SCP Foundation began cataloging the Yule Man in 1974 after a string of violent and eerily similar home invasions during the holiday season. But they have reason to believe that this entity has been around for a whole lot longer. Over 2,000 years, in fact. Stories that describe what look to be Yule Man massacres date back as far as the 1st century BC in Scandinavia, and there have been reports of similar clusters of events happening around the same time every year since. This monster is prolific, and may have one of the highest body counts of any creature under observation by the Foundation. The Yule Man's trail of destruction became clearer in the 18th century, as accounts of the carnage it leaves became more detailed. Later still, authorities even managed to find physical evidence like the Yule Man's fingerprints, which are similar to human fingerprints but display a distinct double whorl pattern not seen in human fingerprints. Much about the anomalous nature of the Yule Man is still unknown though, and the Foundation has yet to discover an effective way to contain it. Their only hope is intercepting it before it can get its long, gnarled fingers on its intended prey. Maybe you're feeling worried, or that you're being watched. You have good reason to be afraid, because during his yearly active period, the 12 days between December 21st and January 2nd, he's always searching for prey. Nowhere is safe, because while it was initially believed that he only appeared to those who live north of 40 degrees latitude, it's now believed that much like Santa Claus, the Yule Man operates worldwide. Anyone could be in his sights right now, blissfully unaware of the nightmare coming down the tracks towards them. Thankfully, the SCP Foundation, through analysis of these attacks, which are known as Weihnacht events, they've been able to find certain patterns. But first, what does the creature known as the Yule Man even look like? Much like SCP-096, the Yule Man is a long and lanky humanoid, standing about 2 meters tall, who resembles an emaciated human of European descent, and never wears any clothes or other coverings despite the frigid temperatures he operates in. You might be sad if you're spending Christmas alone, but it at least guarantees you safety from the Yule Man, as he only appears at the homes of families with a child under the age of 8 present. He also seems to favor isolated and rural locations, and Weihnacht events only occur when there's a healthy covering of snow on the ground during the event, hence the name, which means White Night in English. It's also vital that you recognize the 3 distinct stages of a Weihnacht event too, or you won't be seeing much of the new year. The first stage occurs during the space of a week. Children in the home might start to seem worried or afraid. They might tell you that they see something strange in the distance, the figure of a man they don't recognize, standing just far enough away that you can't fully make him out, except that he's really tall. Of course, you probably won't see anything, and your instinct will be to tell them there's nothing to be afraid of. Even when they tell you, through tears, that there's a man pressing his face up against their bedroom window at night. But they are right to be afraid, and you should be too. Already at this point, your only hope is to try and spread the word as soon as possible. Report the incident to the local police, write about it on Facebook, tweet about it, whatever it takes. The SCP Foundation has operatives trawling the internet and monitoring police reports constantly during this period, especially for reports of mysterious men in the snow watching homes from a distance. Getting the Foundation's attention is your best hope of stopping this thing. And if you don't, next comes Stage 2, taking place between nights 8 and 11 of the active period. No longer will the Yule Man just be lurking on the periphery. Now he's getting closer. You'll start to hear strange noises in your attic or on the roof. Noises that sound almost like footsteps. That's crazy, you think. It's probably just an animal. But then, the smell starts. An awful rotten stench that fills the house. But no matter how hard you look, you can't find the source. Finally, on the last night of December, you'll tell yourself that you'll take this matter to the police. But of course, it's already too late. The Yule Man is here for the 12th night. The Weihnacht is finally upon you. At this point, one of 2 scenarios will happen. In the first, you and your entire family will be tortured and murdered, except the youngest child, who the Yule Man will kidnap. The SCP Foundation keeps files on a number of notable instances of this kind of Weihnacht, and the details are truly gruesome. Reports of incidents have involved crucifixion, the removal of tongues, burning, dismemberment, post-mortem bite marks, and decapitation. In all instances, though, the entire family was killed except the youngest child, who simply disappeared. The Yule Man is a merciless and sadistic beast. You're now probably wondering, if that's the first of 2 Weihnacht possibilities, what's the second? In the second, if you're tremendously lucky, you and your family will survive. But that doesn't mean you won't face a grisly experience. In this scenario, which occurs during about 15% of Weihnacht events, you'll hear footsteps throughout the night, but thankfully you wake up alive. And when you do so, there are gifts waiting for you. The problem is, all these gifts are made out of human body parts. For example, in 1976 in Canada, one family received the gift of a ball made from a severed human head wrapped in skin. In Kazakhstan in 1903, a family received a flute made from a hollowed-out human femur. And in the Netherlands in 2003, a family received a wooden hairbrush covered in human teeth ranging from 400 years old to a mere few days. These gruesome gifts are referred to as SCP-4666-A, and it was one of these gifts that gave us the best insight yet available into the true nature of the Yule Man. Several gifts were dropped off at a family's residence in Hoonah, Alaska in 2018, but most notably among them was the horrific SCP-4666-A-0960, a life-size doll made from a human body with its eyes removed and mouth sewn shut. Worst of all, though, was that the girl was still alive. The family who received this twisted gift was given ME sticks by the Foundation, and the living doll was taken for medical treatment. Before succumbing to her extensive injuries, the girl was able to deliver some insights into what exactly happened to the children who were abducted during Weihnacht events. The children taken by the Yule Man are forced into a large sack that seems much bigger on the inside than it appears as he makes his rounds, traveling from house to house, murdering and kidnapping. His victims are taken to a kind of underground grotto and workshop filled with bones, like a twisted Santa's workshop, where they're forced to make toys out of the bodies of their fellow victims. During this time, the Yule Man will continue to torture and torment his victims. He'll even take some of them away to cook and eat whenever he feels like it. When asked how she was turned into this human doll, the girl told Foundation personnel that her fellow victims were forced to turn her into this by the Yule Man when she became too weak to continue making toys herself. Her chilling last words were, "When you can't make the toys, you become the toys." So if strange things happen to you and your family between the 21st of December and the 1st of January, don't ignore it. After all, you never know who's watching. But if it is the Yule Man's grinning face pressed up against your window, it may already be too late. Happy holidays. 40 years ago, a US Navy exploratory vessel landed on a chain of islands in the South Atlantic, just 2,000 miles off the coast of Argentina. In other words, the middle of nowhere. Yet on this far-off set of rocks afloat in the middle of the ocean, they discovered a vast array of strange wildlife and plant species that resemble little of what they left behind on the mainland. Could this be a treasure trove of undiscovered species, they wondered? Hoping to capitalize on the discovery, a reconnaissance team of researchers was sent out to explore some of the islands on foot, and what they found did not disappoint. From endangered species of birds to plant life and vegetation that looked like it belonged on Mars, they found a dizzying array of new and exciting examples of evolutionary oddities that would fill a library. But unfortunately, their jubilation was cut short. Attempting to collect soil samples, they dug into the ground and soon discovered that what they were standing on wasn't actually ground at all. The Navy scientists soon discovered the rocky terrain they were exploring was actually made up entirely of organic matter. As per the standard protocol, the SCP Foundation was forced to silence the US Navy research vessel after its discovery. With the okay from the US government, the ship was torpedoed and sunk to the bottom of the ocean with all hands on deck, in the name of protecting the greater good of the masses. A tragedy at sea for the sake of preventing worldwide pandemonium. From there, the Foundation took over with the containment procedures of what would eventually come to be known as SCP-169, better known by its nickname, the Leviathan. The Leviathan is a biblical creature of mythical proportions, said to be able to boil the seas and create earth-ending floods with just a whip of its massive continent-spanning body. It is unclear if SCP-169 has the ability to do these things, though, given its massive size, which Foundation researchers estimate to be somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 kilometers. It's easy to see how something that big moving at any speed could be devastating for the coastal regions of the world. Although we use the word contain, it is impossible for SCP staff to ever contain something of such massive size. Surveillance and monitoring are about all we can do for now. That and hope it never wakes up and decides that we're on the menu. It was thought to be relatively smooth sailing, until one incident changed everything. Dr. Hart turned off the video monitor and faced the assembled members of MTF Gamma 6. also known as the Deep Feeders, renowned for their specialization in the tracking of deep sea and oceanic anomalies. The room was dark, and each team member was sitting in shadow, but still Dr. Hart could see the seriousness on their faces. "I'm sure you're wondering why I called you here at such short notice," he said. On the screen behind him, he put up a NASA satellite picture of a small set of rocky islands. "You see this little island chain here? Well, it wasn't there a week ago." He paused, rubbing his forehead from lack of sleep. "At 8:05 a.m. today, we recorded another auditory anomaly emitting from SCP-169. This one was much louder and longer than the one recorded in 1997 by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the one known as the Bloop. Back then, it was easy to brush off as some ice breaking off of a continental shelf and scraping against the seafloor. It's not so easy to cover up anymore. These auditory emissions from SCP-169 are beginning to grow more frequent. More than that, increased seismic activity around the archipelago on the creature's back indicates that the rate at which the creature is breathing is also up. Typically, the rate at which the creature takes what we are assuming to be a breath is once every 3 months. The rate has increased to once every 3 weeks. For as long as we've been monitoring SCP-169, it's been adrift along the southern Atlantic, never moving more than a kilometer a week. That behavior is slowly beginning to change. It doesn't sound like much, but something that big even moving just a fraction of that faster means 100-foot tidal waves for the entire South American coastline. We fear the creature is showing signs of waking up. If this is true, it could mean a cataclysm for the hundreds of nations around the world. Millions, hell, even billions could be wiped off the face of the earth if this thing just flips its body too fast in the wrong direction. To put it to scale, this monster is about the size of the Caribbean, maybe even bigger as far as we know. The doctor then pulled out a decanter of whiskey and poured himself a glass, swallowing the entire pour in one go, in an appalling breach of workplace professionalism. Seriously, an XK class end of the world scenario is still no excuse for drinking on the job. We're talking about an extinction level event. A bona fide XK class end of the world scenario. 1,000-foot tsunami waves stretching as far as the eye can see from either end of the horizon. The last time SCP-169 stirred, it created the Mediterranean. In fact, the legends of the biblical flood, Noah's Ark, the same story can be found in every civilization and culture around the world. So maybe they were onto something. It is to this end I call you all here. To save the world from the next great flood. He paused for a moment as the room took in the gravity of the situation. The more we can learn about SCP-169, the better. And right now, we know squat. For one, we've never seen just how deep the body of the creature goes, or what's under it. The pressure has been too great for our current model submarines, until now. After reinforcing our Nemo-1 deep-sea submersible with thaumaturgical runes, the integrity of its hull has increased exponentially. Your mission will be to travel as far down and as close to the creature as possible. If it breathes, then there must be gills or lungs. There must be some basic biological facts we need to understand if we're going to survive extinction. Our only recourse is to find a way to sedate the creature, and if that doesn't work, then God help us all. Just 12 hours later, deep in the waters of the southern Atlantic, a massive submersible ship was diving down into the depths of the deep ocean, looking for a way to stop the end of the world. Agent JA-6-1, a member of Deep Feeders, looked out of the massive viewing port as the ship slowly descended alongside the rocky trench that made up the body of SCP-169. Behind him was Dr. Hart, sporting a white 5 o'clock shadow and a red nose from a night of drinking to calm his nerves. The entire crew were silent in awe as the giant floodlights of the ship brushed over the barnacle-covered surfaces of the undersea mountain. They progressed slowly, reaching each milestone in depth with caution, knowing that one wrong move could destabilize the pressure in their ship. JA-6-1 murmured the word, "Scales." "What?" asked Dr. Hart. "I've been watching the patterns of the ridges as we sink down. They look like scales. Giant segments. It's hard to see at first because they're so covered in barnacles and sediment, but I'm sure of it. They're giant, armored scales, the way lobsters or crabs have armored exoskeletons." "Interesting," the doctor said, scratching his chin. "Arthropods have segmented armored bodies. This means we might be looking at some sort of evolutionary hybrid, some sort of aquatic mammal such as a whale or dolphin. one that has developed armored segmented scales similar to that of a crustacean. The doctor crossed his arms to think. The closest thing we have on the fossil record of this magnitude is an armored fish from the Cretaceous period, but even that's way too small to compare to this. This thing has an entire ecosystem on its back.
How old is it?
Asked the agent. Well, now that you mention it, given the impossible age of the creature, an arthropod would make sense. Lobsters and other crustaceans don't age conventionally, you see. They are effectively immortal. In fact, they actually die because they continue to grow until their bodies can't hold up their humongous size anymore. And yet, SCP-169 just kept growing. The doctor trailed off, thinking to himself. Dr. Hart, still lost in thought, turned to walk to the back of the submersible as Zhe 6-1 followed. He said as much to himself as to the agent, "The creature is old. The geological survey conducted when SCP-169 was first discovered carbon-dated the specimen to over 541 million years old. As you can probably surmise, that's too old for any living being. The results had to be incorrect, and yet I checked them myself more than once. And numbers do not lie. The entity predates our civilization. Hell, it predates complex life forms on this planet as we know it. From an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't make any sense." The agent, confused, asked, "Doctor, how could something so big even come into existence?" "Very little of our planet is actually landmass. It's a wonder we call it Earth. Most of this planet is water. We aren't looking at a creature that's on our planet, Agent. We are on its planet." Just then a flurry of alarms and sensors began to go off at the bridge of the ship. The team scrambled to their stations, checking off monitors and shouting readings to each other. "The ship's thermal sensors are detecting a massive rise in temperature, transmitting power to cooling systems. We have activity northwest of our location. Sonar has something big headed our way. We need to dive now!" The ship lurched forward, nose first, as everyone on board held on to their seats, the restraints keeping them from falling forward. Just outside of the viewing port, Dr. Hart could see an enormous scaled appendage moving fast in their location. "We need to steer the ship clear of the Talons. Revert all power to the thrusters. Get us out of the way!" the doctor yelled. "Don't you think I'm doing that?" the captain shouted back. The ship jolted sideways and downwards as an immense wave of pressure came over the submersible, putting 6 Gs of force on its occupants. Zhe 6-1 yelped out of fear as the ship came close to crashing into what appeared to be the edge of a titanic talon, the size of the Empire State Building. Following the encounter, the part of the ship bordering the reinforced glass of the viewing port began to glow bright red. "It's boiling the water around us!" one of the crew members cried out. "It's not boiling anything, it's just cavitation due to the pressure reduction in the water. The updated runes on the ship's hull should keep us safe, we just need to cool our heads. Stay focused on the mission, bottom feeders." After several moments of holding their breaths, the crew of Nemo 1 began to relax as their pace returned to a slow descent along the side of the underwater behemoth. Before long, the vessel was no longer traveling straight down, but starting to curve under the creature, traveling north towards the theoretical head of SCP-169. After several hours, the ship came upon giant fissures in the rocky exterior of the creature. These massive vent-like structures appeared stiff, but slowly they opened and closed over the span of weeks. These were the respiratory organs of the organism. Clocking it at over 2 miles underneath the surface of the ocean, the crew carefully began entering the smaller pod-like submersibles that detached from the main ship. Zhe 6-1 entered his pod and strapped on the haptic gloves that would give him control of the pod's robotic arms. He and a team of 3 other volunteers had agreed to undergo the dangerous mission of attaching artificial chemical emission machines that could be programmed to release anesthetic gas into SCP-169's respiratory system on command remotely. The emission machines could be refueled manually whenever the contents ran out. It was an ingenious solution Dr. Hart came up with when thinking of his time studying sharks as a marine biologist. They would tag the fins of sharks by capturing them and bringing the specimens on the deck of their boat. From there, the scientists would drill a radio frequency emitter onto the fin of the shark. When he had first seen this practice as a young college student, Dr. Hart was afraid the process was harming the shark, but later he learned it was designed in a way to not be harmful to the specimen, and eventually the tag would fall off after enough data on the shark's movement was collected. Except these tags would not be falling off, he thought. They could not. For the sake of all mankind, this had to work. The doctor pressed a button on the receiver of the radio and spoke. J 6-1, what's your status? Pressure's holding, all signs look good. J 6-2, pressure's holding, all good. J 6-3, all clear, Captain. J 6-4, there was silence. J 6-4, do you copy? All clear, Doc. Sorry, my mic was muted. En route and ready to do this thing. Dr. Hart sighed in relief and slowly reclined in his chair, watching the pods move closer to the large openings on SCP-169's side. One by one, the robotic arms used underwater torches to drill into the thick, rock-like exoskeleton of the creature, screwing in complex million-dollar equipment that was both waterproof and could withstand the immense pressure at such a depth under the ocean. As the minutes turned to hours, Dr. Hart couldn't help but feel anxiety for the safety of his crew and the success of the mission. But before long, the pods began to return one by one to the mothercraft, each completing the segment of work with which they were tasked. The last pod still working was J 6-1, whose robotic arm was in the process of rotating a large industrial-sized screw. J 6-1 had all but finished when suddenly a low rumble could be felt shaking the larger submersible. Dr. Hart's voice came crackling over the radio. Get back to the ship now! J 6-1, wrapped in deep focus on his task, replied, I'm just about finished, just packing up my tool belt. Leave it. Return to the ship now. That's an order. Jesus, what's wrong? It's not like this is the end of the world, said the agent, chuckling over his radio. An ear-piercing echo sent shockwaves through the depths of the ocean around the submersible. The waves rumbled with the sound of SCP-169's voice, similar to the sound of a large whale, but amplified by a million. The sound sent all the crew members falling to the floor as the ship experienced severe damage from the burst of pressure, slightly cracking the glass viewport and sending smoke flooding into the small bridge of the ship. Gas masks! Shouted Dr. Hart as they all donned breathing apparatus. SCP-169 is waking up. Begin activation of the chemical emission machines. We need to sedate it now. The Leviathan is waking up. We need to stop it, shouted Dr. Hart. Just then, he looked back and noticed J 6-1's pod was gone. J 6-1, what's your position? J 6-1, where are you? Sir, sonar has him drifting off deeper into the ocean behind us. He must have gotten knocked off SCP-169 by the shockwave. But Dr. Hart wouldn't have it. He didn't want any more blood on his hands. Reverse thrusters, turn us around and get to him. We're not losing anyone. But the breach in the hull. It'll hold. That's what the ruins are for. The outside of the submersible began to glow a slight blue as the ship's system started to come back online to full capacity, and alarm systems started to turn off and report normal pressure readings. Before long, the Nemo 1 had caught up to J 6-1's pod and retrieved the agent, who had been knocked unconscious by the shockwave. Once the agent was back on the main ship, the doctor turned his attention back to the monitors, making sure the installations they drilled into the creature were functional. Slowly, the machines came online to full power, and the speed at which SCP-169 had been moving began to slow ever so slightly. The team all watched the viewport in silence as a steady stream of anesthetic gas was pumped into the respiratory system of the gigantic living myth in front of them. After a few moments of waiting, the doctor spoke. I think it worked, he said with a smile. The crew erupted in cheers as they radioed control back up on land that the mission had been a success. The message quickly reached the O5 Council, where a red alert status was de-escalated, and the O5 members withdrew from their plan of leaving the current Earth for that of an alternate universe. The whole crew began to sing and celebrate the prevention of the end of the world, as Dr. Hart simply stood in front of the massive viewport, watching the mountainous specimen slowly grow smaller in the distance as the submersible began ascending back to the world above. J 6-1 came over to congratulate him, patting him on the back. We did it, he said. Loosen up. The doctor managed to laugh along in acknowledgement. That we did, he said in relief. That we did. The two watched the deep blue ocean in silence, taking in the vastness of the sea. Perhaps this would not be the end of it, but that day, they had done what the SCP Foundation did best. Kick that apocalyptic can a few miles down the road. And sometimes, in the face of the terrifying and the infinite, that's really the best you can do. Someone was screaming inside the incinerator. The year was 1975. The location was a top-secret refinery and waste disposal plant, one of the many front organizations owned and operated by the SCP Foundation. This sprawling facility, separated into 3 different huge units, each with a specialized task, was located around 75 kilometers outside of Summer Springs, Colorado. It had operated for several decades without incident, but today all hell was about to break loose. Alarms were blaring in Unit C, the area of the facility that dealt with destroying non-anomalous waste via incineration. A traumatized worker had pulled the emergency lever near one of the incinerators in a panic when he'd first heard the loud banging against the interior walls, and then those horrific pained wails. That's when workers of Unit C came to a horrifying realization. The screams weren't just coming from one of the incinerators in Unit C. They were coming from all 6, a chorus of absolute agony echoing up out of the ash pits. This was impossible as far as the Unit C staff were concerned. These incinerators were only to be used for confirmed non-anomalous material. Could some animals or even some poor workers somehow fallen into the incinerators? But even if they had, what were the odds that someone had fallen in all 6 of them at once? It was impossible. The site director was immediately brought in to authorize an investigation, at which point he determined that at least one of the furnaces, in this case furnace number 4, be shut off so researchers and guards could investigate what was going on inside. It seemed like the obvious course of action, but for some of the people on site that day, this would prove to be a fatal mistake. When the fires were put out, something started rattling in the disposal chute. There was a scratching and squealing noise, like something scraping up against the metal. A maintenance worker was ordered to go check inside, and when he opened the hatch, he let out a bone-chilling shriek. There was something, or was it someone, climbing back up the disposal chute. It emerged from the darkness, backlit by the still-burning embers of the incinerator, letting out an awful screeching noise that could make even a hardened Mobile Task Force operative shake with fear. The creature was humanoid, a charred, mutilated skeleton reaching out towards the maintenance worker with a bony claw. Before the worker had a chance to stumble back in horror, the beast had clasped him by the throat and started to squeeze. It didn't even need to strangle him. The heat of its skeletal hand burned away the worker's throat in seconds, leaving his limp, wheezing body to drop to the metal grate of the platform below him. Several armed guards and maintenance workers moved forward to fend off the monster, but just then a volley of more violent shrieks echoed out of the chute behind it. It only took seconds for over a dozen more creatures to crawl out of the disposal chute. They were all like the first, people at various stages of incineration. Some were glowing, charred skeletons with barely any flesh, others looking more like severe burn victims, their faces contoured into scowls of hate and rage. The assembled guards opened fire on the sudden influx of anomalies, emptying the magazines of their submachine guns into their burning bodies, but their weapons didn't seem to cause any lasting damage. The bullets would tear through the flesh of the creatures, causing some of them to stumble and fall, but the wounds would close and the creatures would rise again. It seemed they possessed a deadly combo of extremely high aggression and incredible regenerative abilities. None of the staff present in Unit C were safe as the burning corpses attacked anyone they could find with their bare hands, beating and biting and clawing. Many of them would grapple with Foundation personnel, latching onto them and trying to pull them back down into the incinerator with them. These creatures, that would later be known as SCP-2419-A, caused several fatalities with their surprise attack that day, and the situation was only brought back under control when a mobile task force that possessed more advanced training and weaponry was dispatched to the location. Despite orders from the site director, the MTF found it impossible to actually terminate any of the entities due to their regenerative abilities. Instead, the MTF agents focused on forcing the anomalies back into the chute of incinerator number 4 using a powerful industrial steam lance. Once they were back inside, the incinerator's burners were started up once again. The MTFs were also able to capture 5 of the entities and detain them for questioning and experimentation, finally bringing this unexpected containment breach to an end. The Foundation is an organization that prides itself on possessing forbidden and secret knowledge. but even they had no idea what had just happened. There seemed to be no earthly explanation why these creatures would suddenly manifest inside the incinerators. But as the detained anomalies continued regenerating, a slightly clearer picture of what exactly the Foundation was dealing with began to emerge. Every single one of the captured anomalies kept regenerating, and upon getting to the point that they were no longer burn-scarred, the researchers studying the anomalous creatures discovered that each one was identical to a deceased D-class from the Foundation's records. They were physically and genetically identical to the dead Class D personnel, perfect copies, save for the fact that their sole mission in life seemed to now be pure and unmitigated aggression and violence. Researchers wanted to gain greater insight into the minds of these strange creatures through the use of extensive psychological evaluations and interviews. It would turn out to be a very dangerous investigation. A psychological researcher by the name of Dr. Warren conducted an interview with one of the SCP-2419 instances in hopes of better understanding their mindset. This creature had been heard laughing not long before the interview began, so it wasn't an unreasonable assumption to believe that it could be capable of speech. The interviewee was separated from Dr. Warren by a thick pane of glass to prevent it from indulging in any of its more violent urges. The problem was that Dr. Warren and his assistant researchers had severely underestimated what these creatures were capable of doing to get what they wanted. Dr. Warren tried to begin the interview in good faith. He spoke calmly and politely to the creature through the glass, attempting to remind it of the person it once was. The anomaly didn't appear to be paying attention to the doctor, though, instead focusing on pulling its own arm apart and breaking the bones within. Dr. Warren began to think that the creatures weren't even sentient, if the only activity they seemed to engage in was the wanton destruction of themselves and others. But underestimating them like this proved to be a big mistake. By removing the skin off of its arm and whittling its bone down to sharp edges, the anomaly had transformed its arm into a makeshift knife. Before anyone realized this, it had already used its own jagged bones to break the glass divider and attack Dr. Warren. He perished not long after being stabbed multiple times in his face and eyes, and the anomaly was forcefully taken back to its holding cell. Dr. Daniel Jennings, a senior researcher, was then put on the case. He released a chilling memo of the creatures after his observation period ended. It read, "Before I came here, I worked as a prison shrink. Every person you met had a story bursting with pain and sorrow. Sometimes these stories were about the pain they suffered. Sometimes it was about the pain they inflicted. Some days you felt like everyone there was a beautiful soul torn down by their circumstances. Other days you'd find out what some of them did, and a part of you was glad that they were there to suffer for it. But at the end of every day, I always told myself, they're all humans. They're all people. They all deserve the same dignity, respect, and love as everyone else. No exceptions." Dr. Jennings goes on, "I opened up with that anecdote only so that you could understand that what I'm about to say is not said lightly. These things are not people. They are people-shaped monsters. They are well beyond any definition of psychopathy. Everything they do to hurt, maim, and kill. I would pity them, but that would imply that they're worth pitying. Put them in a hole, then fill that hole with concrete. Better still, throw them back into the incinerator where you found them. I doubt they'll even care." Following this string of unfortunate incidents, containment procedures were put into place to hopefully prevent anything that had happened to the unlucky Foundation staff from happening again. The entire facility was fenced off and was constantly patrolled by MTF Beta 7, also known as the Maz Hatters, a group specializing in containing anomalies which present powerful biological, chemical, or radiological dangers. The furnaces that the anomalous creatures emerge from remain lit at all times, with workers checking and carrying out maintenance on every single one each day of the week. Outside of this, the facility is essentially a no-go zone. Reinforced steel hatches cover the chutes, and they are to forever remain bolted shut. All because of that one terrifying day in 1975. That was the day that the Summer Springs Waste Disposal Facility, which had been a valuable asset to the Foundation for decades, instead became classified as the Euclid-class anomaly, SCP-2419. It is not uncommon for a Foundation asset to one day become a dangerous anomaly requiring containment, but the same question always pops up after. Why? What had a place that had been so valuable to the Foundation suddenly become such an active danger? The answer, as is often the case, is contained within the question. Why would a waste disposal plant be so important to the Foundation in the first place? And more importantly, what else was going on at the plant to make it such an area of active importance for one of the most powerful organizations in the entire world? To put it simply, the plant allowed the Foundation to dispose of something far more important than mere waste material. It gave them what they needed to better erase memories. As you probably already know, the Foundation makes liberal use of amnestics on those exposed to anomalous material to make them forget what they had seen and experienced. But these elusive chemicals, many of which are sourced from SCP-3000, are an inexact science. However, at the Summer Springs Waste Disposal Plant, researchers discovered an immensely valuable alternative. Much of what was disposed of in the incinerators of Unit C were the bodies of dead D-Class personnel. Before being burned, autopsies were performed on the bodies to make sure they were non-anomalous, including the brain. Back in the 1960s, while performing research on the brains of dead D-Classes, they found a method of extracting and distilling the positive memories of the dead, creating a kind of happy soup. When administered into someone who has undergone amnestic treatment, this happy soup creates positive false memories in their mind that fills in those pesky blank spaces that are often behind. This was so useful that happy memories were extracted from the minds of every single D-Class corpse that passed through Unit C, totaling well into the thousands by the time that the first SCP-2419-A instances began to rise. But as all happiness, joy, and love were removed from the minds of the D-Classes, it seemed that all that was left was pure hate, pain, violence, and fury, feelings too intense and evil to destroy. These were bodies imbued with a malice so powerful that no fire could ever burn them away. They exist now with single-minded determination to get out and destroy everything around them, everything, including the ones that made them, the SCP Foundation itself. And in the end, it's only a matter of time until they get out. There are thousands of them in there, unable to die, unable to stop. The only thing keeping them in there is the constant burning of the furnaces around them, and those furnaces can't burn forever. The monsters lurking in SCP-2419 will outlive the fire that surrounds them. Because while the furnaces they are contained in are hot, the fires of hate that burn within SCP-2419 entities are even more powerful. And they know this. They know they can't be contained forever, and that someday soon, they'll be able to emerge and exact their terrible revenge. Those who must walk past the incinerators may think they hear their screams echoing out from within, but it's not screaming at all. It's laughter. When it comes to bugs, the SCP Foundation certainly has its hands full. You might remember SCP-726, a species of bowfly aptly named the Reconstructive Maggots, who recreated the bodies of other organisms through horrible reproduction methods. There's also SCP-2031, a colony of anomalous ants that would eat their victims' insides and burrow themselves in the bodies, puppeting them around and masquerading as the creature they just ate, even if it was a person. Today on SCP Explained, we're going to be talking about a new species of anomalous insect, SCP-378, nicknamed the Brainworm. Well, it's an anomaly only new to us. For the Foundation, SCP-378's discovery and containment dates back to the days of the American Secure Containment Initiative. The American Secure Containment Initiative could be considered a predecessor to the SCP Foundation, active for the majority of the first half of the 20th century. While most of the stories go that the ASCI, alongside several other paranormal investigation organizations, eventually came together and formed the SCP Foundation in the early 50s, the reality is a lot murkier. As we all know, it's very hard to completely kill off an organization in the anomalous world. The secrecy and decentralization practically ensures that there's always going to be some stragglers left. And in the ASCI's case, that certainly seems to be the case. SCP-378's file indicates that by 1963, the ASCI was still around and kicking, though it was definitely living on borrowed time due to the rising prominence of the SCP Foundation. The two organizations, the growing Foundation and the dying ASCI, attempted to keep tabs on one another throughout the decade, but the Foundation's espionage programs proved to be more intensive and thorough. For whatever reason, the Foundation was always getting the best intel, whether it was beating the ASCI to the punch on newly discovered anomalies, gaining access to otherwise classified information only available in ASCI documents of the highest security clearances, or finding ways to benefit from the organization's detriments through diplomatic meetings that always seemed to work in the Foundation's favor. It was clear that the SCP Foundation was the new hotness, and the ASCI would have a lot of catching up to do if it wanted to remain relevant in this new post-World War II world. Unfortunately, we all know what happened. The majority of the ASCI was absorbed into the Foundation shortly after its formation, and the pieces that remained would fade into obscurity in the coming years. But why was the Foundation's intel so good? More funding? Better trained agents? Luck? The answer, if you're familiar with the Foundation's ways, shouldn't come as a surprise. Of course, there was always going to be more going on behind the scenes, and that's where SCP-378 comes in. SCP-378 is an arthropod, resembling an Amazonian giant centipede, specifically one in the larval stage. SCP-378 measures about 3 meters long, with a thickness of 233 kilograms, and it possesses otherwise ordinary biological features, while about as normal as an anomaly contained by the SCP Foundation can get. On the dietary side, it eats like a normal centipede, consuming primarily other insects and lichen. On the reproductive side, things are a bit different. SCP-378 reproduces asexually, meaning that it's capable of generating offspring entirely through its own biological functions, which it excretes from its backside. A newly birthed instance, designated SCP-378-A, resembles a fully grown adult Amazonian giant centipede right from birth. But dissection of these baby peds suggests that this resemblance is superficial, as SCP-378-A's organ systems, beyond a primitive neural network, are entirely non-existent. These babies are essentially shell organisms, intended to be used by SCP-378, the host centipede, as remote drones. And that's how SCP-378 proves to be useful to the Foundation at large. You see, 378-A are endoparasites, meaning that they're organisms that live inside other organisms, like a tapeworm, but so much worse. SCP-378-A are used by SCP-378 to infect advanced primates, such as ourselves, but also a whole host of offshoots of humanity, such as the Homo ignotus, also known as SCP-655, and the Gigantopithecus sapiens, the common Sasquatch, which you might recognize as SCP-1000. SCP-378-A enters a host through an open orifice, and after infection, the entity will integrate itself with the host's nervous system through means that are poorly understood by the Foundation. This includes brain death of the host, and extending SCP-378's remote control through its offspring and into the host itself. Vital functions and sensory input remain unaffected, meaning that the host still retains some semblance of life function. Just, without a brain or anything. They're not there. They're just puppets, but you'll never be able to tell. When you think of someone being puppeted by an anomalous parasite, you'd probably expect them to act a little weird. Maybe they don't speak right, or maybe they start slithering on the floor or eating only small lizards. But that's not the case with victims of SCP-378. No. Once its offspring have infected a suitable host, SCP-378 will actually do a pretty decent job of integrating its victims back into their respective social sphere. This means maintaining all of their previous relationships as best as possible, such as keeping their jobs, and otherwise fitting in and not standing above the crowd. You'd probably assume they prefer to keep a low profile, mainly infecting hosts in small towns and sleepy suburbs. But you'd be wrong there too. SCP-378 loves the big city, places with high population density, and a robust entertainment scene. We'll explain later, but SCP-378 differs from ordinary insects in that its basic instinct isn't to just infect and reproduce, it's to have fun, and the way it entertains itself is by living the lives of people who otherwise live busy, engaging lives, filled with plenty of social interactivity and places to go. The Foundation has yet to discover the upper limit of SCP-378, as the centipede has managed to infect quite a number of hosts with its offspring, which it all seems to maintain simultaneously without issue. Upon interrogation of a host, SCP-378 confesses to the existence of 26 human hosts, 2 instances of Guatemalan black howler monkeys, and 3 instances of SCP-1000. Considering the complex social hierarchies of monkeys, it's unsurprising that SCP-378 infected a few of them just to try them out, on top of infecting a few Sasquatches in the form of SCP-1000, which SCP-378 conveniently is immune to the inherent anomalous effects of. But there is no question as to which species SCP-378 prefers. In fact, those other things it infected, according to the host, were only acquired during periods of heavy intoxication. See, the centipede enjoys getting a little tipsy too. You can't have that in the Amazon rainforest. As humanity is the dominant species on Earth, we're the ones with the shiniest toys for SCP-378 to play with, the most exciting lives, filled with more pointless interaction and labor than a bug would know what to do with. And that's what makes SCP-378 so intriguing for the Foundation. It's an intelligent parasite, whose only motivation is to keep society running as normal so it can slip behind a few pairs of human eyes and see what it's like in the world it would never get to otherwise live in. Some of you are already thinking it, but SCP-378 is the perfect anomaly for the Foundation to use against its foes and adversaries. And as we covered earlier, in the 1960s, the Foundation had a lot to prove, mainly against the American Secure Containment Initiative. The Foundation knew to classify SCP-378 as a Thaumiel class object. It was promptly contained in an underground terrarium filled with plenty of juicy lichen and ants for SCP-378 to feed on. Of course, there was also a decontamination chamber constructed adjacent to the regular containment chamber. Any personnel who would go in would obviously be at risk to an infection from SCP-378, and we're sure that living the crazy, exciting life of a Foundation agent would have satisfied the sociable bug. But the SCP Foundation wasn't taking any risks. As a result, anyone entering the chamber would have to wear full body protection, and if they were found to be infected during the decontamination process, they would be terminated. After discovery of SCP-378, the Foundation immediately saw the potential in utilizing the anomaly for espionage purposes. After all, it would be a perfect spy network, capable of fitting in and maintaining ordinary roles while also communicating with SCP-378, who would feed information to the Foundation through another host. The impeccable precision of SCP-378's maintenance of its host's social personas would make the entity almost impenetrable to sniff out in the field, even for trained agents who deal with the anomalous. SCP-378's initial psychological evaluation was performed by the well-known Foundation psychologist, Dr. Simon Glass. Dr. Glass found that SCP-378 was obviously unique among arthropods and possessed either human level of sapience, or at the very least, the ability to emulate its host's intellectual faculties. Regardless, the anomaly was intelligent, but a point of interest for Dr. Glass was SCP-378's relationship with its hosts. It maintained a constant, consistent sense of identity across multiple hosts. But interviews with SCP-378 revealed that it was fully aware that it was not those hosts in actuality. SCP-378 was essentially role-playing various human identities. It wasn't just easy for the Foundation to figure out that the centipede enjoyed masquerading as its hosts. It pretty much spelled it out with giant letters. SCP-378's hosts rarely interact with or send information directly back to SCP-378 or fellow hosts, because SCP-378 is in full control at all times. This is literally just a game for SCP-378, a source of entertainment. And if one of those hosts came under duress or was at risk of being found out by those in its life, 378 could easily abandon the host persona, which it had no issues in doing. Dr. Glass found that the host behavior was largely unique to each instance, and extroverted personalities were a favorite for SCP-378. Hosts rarely isolate themselves, except to sleep or use the bathroom, and SCP-378 appeared to take equal enthusiasm in both stressful and pleasant situations. After all, this was all a big role-playing session for it. SCP-378 appreciated some excitement in the lives of its subjects. In a way, this was like an infinite source of entertainment. You could live as many lives as you wanted at once, have almost no attachment to any consequences, because you're a bug who has no stake in the real world, and you get to experience things no other member of your species ever has or ever will. SCP-378 really is living the dream. Even to another human, this sounds pretty fun. We only get one life to live. SCP-378 gets to live as many as it wants. But Dr. Glass found another interesting fact about SCP-378. It was attached to a certain identity. Lisa Martin, a 33-year-old Mexican-American female employee at Digiana Tono's Pies, a pizza chain located in Staten Island, New York. Dr. Glass was a bit unsure as to why SCP-378 enjoyed Miss Martin so much, but it was clear from the way it talked about her that this was its favorite persona. And Dr. Glass could see why the more he studied Martin's routine. It was the perfect mixture of business, idleness, routine labor, and general engagement for SCP-378 to experience. Lisa Martin's routine was static. On every day except Saturday, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., Lisa Martin would show up to work at Digiana Tono's Pies. After she finished work, from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., Martin would engage in maintenance of one of 17 rooftop gardens across New York City. Of these gardens, Glass discovered that 13 are maintained by volunteer organizations, 12 of which Martin was not a part of. On Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m., Martin alternated between socializing with a collection of friends and coworkers and playing piano for various high-end bars. On all days from 11 p.m. to 12 a.m., Martin would shower and then prepare for bed. She would sleep from 12 a.m. to 7 a.m., and in the morning she'd get back up and do it all over again. When you see a person's schedule laid out like this, everything seems a bit more routine and less exciting, huh? It's not an exciting life laid out on paper, but SCP-378 loved it, for whatever reasons. Attempts to interrupt Lisa Martin's routine were unilaterally met with unusual levels of hostility from the bug and its hosts, and in the event of Lisa Martin's death, SCP-378 would happily direct another host to assume her identity. Yeah, we're not sure either. Regardless, 378 had a hobby, many hobbies, but Lisa Martin was special. Dr. Glass's evaluation proved to be popular with the upper ranks of the Foundation, who, due to SCP-378's intelligence and awareness of human sentience, could prove to be useful to the overall mission of the Foundation. As we said before, in 1963, the Foundation had to contend with a number of powerful adjacent organizations, the Global Occult Coalition, with their destructive tendencies and the backing of the world governments, GRU Division P, the Soviet Union's anomalous research military unit, the remnants of the American Secure Containment Initiative, who, while not as prominent or as powerful as they used to be, still remained an organization capable of deterring the Foundation. As a result, the Foundation looked into applying SCP-378 through practical means. Dr. Glass's work importance could not be understated, but the prevailing theory was that SCP-378 did not understand the significance of social dynamics in regards to hierarchy and social capital. This could be observed in its strange defense of Lisa Martin. Several of SCP-378's hosts held positions of power, two of which, David Lockheed and Alfonso Leos, were even employed by anomalous organizations, and beyond the reach of the Foundation's then capacity to contain. Even holding these powerful positions, SCP-378 displayed a willingness to sacrifice the hosts to defend, replace, or otherwise maintain Lisa Martin, its favorite host. It was here when the Foundation saw an opportunity. If they could use SCP-378's favoritism of Martin to get it to do what they wanted, their dream spy network had a chance of manifesting into reality. David Lockheed, one of SCP-378's hosts, was a low-level employee of the ASCI, but if the Foundation was able to persuade SCP-378, using Martin's safety as collateral, Lockheed could rise through the ranks of the organization into a position where the Foundation needed a puppet. Second, they realized that Martin herself could prove to be a useful asset. The Foundation was always looking for new ways to conduct reconnaissance, and pizza parlors were an ideal meeting spot and espionage center, if they could be kept from the public eye. Martin's place of employment would soon be converted from your average Staten Island pizza parlor to one of the Foundation's very own spicy crust pizza chains. See what they did there? Spicy crust pizza, SCP. They are so clever. Regardless, the use of SCP-378's anomalous abilities to defend Foundation operatives in the United States seemed like a useful prospect, and the idea was put to a vote by the Overseer Council. It passed, with only minor detraction, under the name of the Kraken Protocol. As a result, SCP-378's containment procedures were updated, and containment of the anomaly would be focused on three primary components. Its first host, SCP-378-1, was held in the Area 19 barracks of the SCP Foundation. -1 was employed as a maintenance technician with a low security clearance, and in the case of death, a brain-dead or comatose reserve personnel would be elected to replace it. SCP-378-1 served as the Foundation's primary means of communication with SCP-378. After all, they needed a channel to speak directly to the bug in charge, and -1 was their way of doing so. SCP-378-2 was David Lockheed, an average employee of the American Secure Containment Initiative, working in their clerical sector. Lockheed was tasked with sabotaging ASCI operations for the Foundation, as well as collecting information in the Foundation's interests. SCP-378-2 was a little more difficult to replace than the average SCP-378 host, and was required to follow a strict health and exercise regimen. If something were to happen to Lockheed, there's no telling if the Foundation would be able to replace him, and the chances of that happening were low. Lockheed was the perfect spy, with an established rapport with the ASCI going back at least a decade, and access to information the Foundation would use to outsmart the initiative at every turn. It shouldn't come as a surprise to you that the ASCI's days were numbered, and eventually, they closed their doors entirely. SCP-378-3 was Lisa Martin, who worked at Spicy Crust Pizza in Staten Island. Martin's purpose was to maintain a network for Foundation operatives in New York and host a place where they could congregate and meet without issue. On top of that, Martin was still SCP-378's favorite persona, and the entire operation hinged on SCP-378 having Martin available to it. As a result, Lisa Martin would have to be replaced as soon as possible if anything were to happen to her. And with that, the Kraken Protocol was in place. Each instant formed a part of the Foundation's information gathering campaign, and was outfitted with a tracking device and an audio recorder. Every week, embedded agents stationed near each host were to evaluate the health and integrity of them, and the equipment they had inside them. If this initial rollout was a success, the Foundation would continue to use SCP-378-A in further infiltration of its enemies, but the Foundation would have to see how things played out first. Less than 2 years later, Lockheed had retrieved significant information for the Foundation, and the Kraken Protocol proved to be a success. A new site, Site 56, located near prominent anomalous locations, was about to be constructed. SCP-378 seemed excited at the prospects of a change in scenery and more hosts to infiltrate, but there was also something the Foundation could never have expected. In an attempt to gain a new host for SCP-378 to control, the Foundation came across something disturbing. Their target was an agent of the FBI's Unusual Incident Unit. After drugging him and bringing him back to the Foundation in order to receive an SCP-378-A instance inside him, SCP-378 informed the Foundation that it couldn't establish a connection with the agent. The personnel were confused. The agent was still alive, and 378 never had any difficulty in connecting with hosts before. They did a number of tests on the agent and tried to figure out what went wrong. That's when the Foundation discovered that there was a different centipede inside the agent's head, where the SCP-378-A instance would typically be. It looked like the Foundation had a much bigger issue on their hand than they ever had realized. The year was 1861. Arthur Duplessis, one of the world's most renowned explorers and adventurers, hacked through the thick vines of the Amazon rainforest with a well-worn machete. He grunted and strained, his clothes heavy and skin slick with sweat. He took a deep swig from his canteen and paused briefly to breathe. This was the second week of his solo expedition into the lung of the world, and the process had been grueling. He'd fought off piranhas, electric eels, and invasive kangaroo fish while wading and kayaking down the Amazon River. He'd contended with tribesmen and poachers, and narrowly dodged his fair share of poisonous beasties that could take down prey 3 times their size. No sane man would brave this horror for its own sake, but Arthur has as good a reason as any. He was searching for his younger brother, Joseph Duplessis, who had disappeared a month earlier during a trek through the Amazon. Joseph had always admired his brother's wild adventures and sought to imitate him. It was for that very reason that Arthur had felt responsible for his brother's current predicament and made it his mission to rescue him. The Amazon is an ancient and cruel mistress. The arrogant and foolish have hoped to conquer or tame her for centuries, but countless men had disappeared in the pulsing heart of this green behemoth. Arthur may have been a world-class explorer in a different league to many of the others whose lives this green inferno has handedly taken, but there were creatures lurking deep in the Amazon that went beyond even Arthur's knowledge. The kind of beasts that would make the darkest and most twisted nightmares look comparatively inviting. Beasts like SCP-2031. If Joseph was able to send Arthur one more message before it all came to a horrible end, we could only imagine it'd be something like, "Don't come for me. It's already too late. But there's still time to save yourself, brother. Stay away, for God's sake, stay away. You have no idea what you're dealing with here. Forget about me. Go while there's still time." Sadly for Arthur Duplessis, that time was about to run out. He ventured further into the depths of the Amazon, where even light was scarce under the thick canopy above. A mighty green anaconda slithered through a nearby tributary, tongue flailing in search of prey. An Amazonian giant centipede, a centipede so large and vicious it preys on snakes and bats, skittered up a nearby tree on 46 needle-like legs. A big, meaty tarantula deftly navigated the branches above, while tree frogs with poison potent enough to put an entire army 6 feet under hopped through the rich undergrowth. Humans held no power here. Arthur fell to his knees and began to weep. His foolish ambitions had gotten his dear brother killed in this awful place, shot to death by poachers, strangled by anacondas, or eaten alive by vicious bull sharks in the Amazon River. There were so many horrible ways that Joseph could had died, and in the absence of ever finding a body, all of them would simultaneously be true. The Duplessis family would never know peace. There would be a void, an emptiness in all of their hearts forever. But just when Arthur was about to give up hope, something miraculous happened. He saw a human figure stumbling around faintly in the distance. Arthur drew his trusty pistol, assuming it could be a poacher or a hostile tribesman, but something was different. The figure had its back to Arthur, but he recognized its shirt, a distinctive shade of light blue, just like the shirt that Arthur had bought for Joseph on his previous birthday. Could it be? Was it really him? Arthur holstered his weapon and jumped to his feet. He couldn't let this figure get away, even if there was only the tiniest chance it could actually be his brother and not some kind of forest mirage. Arthur ran towards the figure with the last of his energy reserves, panting and wheezing. He called his brother's name again and again, but the figure didn't respond. It just stumbled along, as though drunk. But the closer Arthur got, the more certain he was that this was indeed his brother. The height, the hair, the clothes, the build. It was Joseph Duplessis, but why wasn't he responding? Why wouldn't he turn around? As Arthur finally reached the figure, he ground to a halt. The most profound sense of dread fell over him like a sudden monsoon. Something unnatural, something truly terrible was about to happen, but he didn't know what. And moreover, it was too late to stop now. Feeling anxiety prickling up his legs and back, Arthur reached forward to grab his brother by the shoulder, the word Joseph trembling on his lips. When Arthur's hand touched Joseph's shoulder, he felt a fear greater than anything he'd experienced before. Something was moving beneath the skin of Joseph's shoulder, something writhing and alive. A million tiny creatures all working together in his brother's flesh. Before he could even draw his hand away, his brother turned. or rather the creatures that were wearing his brother's body, turned around. Arthur couldn't help but scream at the horrible sight before him. His brother's face looked loose and rotten, aging skin hanging off a rotting skull. His jaw hung loose, no tongue inside, no eyes either. Just millions of ants swarming in and out of Joseph Duplessis's vacant dead face. The ants were huge and spiny, with long curved mandibles. Ection bruxelli, a particularly hardy species of New World army ant. Arthur stepped back, babbling in terror at what had become of his brother. The Joseph suit stepped forward towards him, and almost instinctively, Arthur pushed him with both hands, feeling the nightmarish activity swarming beneath the loose cover of Joseph's bony chest. The Joseph suits tumbled backward, tripping over a rock, and burst. There were no organs left inside his brother now. They'd been eaten long ago. It was just a thin tarpaulin of gray skin over dry bones, and of course, millions upon millions of ants, now making a beeline for Arthur with the frightening military precision any naturalist could expect from Ecton bruxelli. But while army ants could be a formidable and frightening foe in their own right, nobody had seen any ants like this before. Well, nobody who'd lived to tell the tale, at least. Arthur turned to flee, but sadly it was already too late for him. What he thought were mere prickles of anxiety were actually an invasion force of Ecton bruxelli soldiers, which had positioned themselves over key nerves and ligaments on his skin and spine. As Arthur tried to run away, the ants began to bite into him, cutting through skin, rending bone and munching into the chewy neurons underneath. Arthur felt intense flashes of pain all over his body before collapsing to the ground, paralyzed. That's when the true horrors began. If there was one consolation for Arthur in this last terrible hours of his life, he would at least know firsthand exactly how his brother died. He couldn't move, but he could feel everything. The creatures chewed through the flesh of his extremities, cutting holes in his skin and creating openings for swarms of their insect brethren to enter through. Arthur felt like he was on fire as the swarm entered his body, but was unable to do anything about it. Death by these creatures is a slow and torturous experience. Unlike their non-anomalous counterparts, the swarms don't immediately start devouring all available soft tissue. SCP-2031 wants to keep their prey alive while they renovate their new home. Arthur finally died 2 days later, from dehydration. It was at this point that the creatures finally began eating his organs and eventually distributing their colony throughout his body. The ants even produce an enzyme that slows the decaying process for their deceased hosts. That's why Joseph Duplessis didn't look a whole lot worse by the time Arthur found him, even though he'd already suffered a month of post-mortem infestation. Not long after Arthur's death, the Arthur suit got up and walked away. The world would never know how or why Arthur Duplessis and his brother disappeared in the dark heart of the Amazon jungle, but perhaps for the sake of all those who loved them, ignorance is actually kinder than the truth. It would be almost a century before the Foundation finally discovered these creatures on a nearby farm, designated them SCP-2031, and began containment and testing. They soon became aware of what Arthur, Joseph, and many others had learned the hard way. While they may be relatively ineffectual individually, together these insects were a real force to be reckoned with. Very few non-anomalous animals had any chance of escaping them once they'd set their sights on a target and began assuming their attack positions. In one observed instance, SCP-2031 soldiers were able to take down a 1,000-kilogram Angus bull in 5 minutes, most of which was just spent getting their soldiers into their proper positions over the spine and leg ligaments. The Foundation just got extremely lucky that these vicious insect predators happened to be isolated to some pretty specific areas in South America, thanks to the climate requirements of their habitats. In fact, pretty much all of the specimens the Foundation found were all in one place. The creatures had developed a particularly frightening form of ant farm known as SCP-2031-A, an isolated containment zone on a stretch of farmland where the ants could find hosts in the form of live people and animals, keeping them relatively isolated. 27 separate SCP-2031 colonies were first found on this farm, inhabiting and operating 27 different corpses. These include 15 cows, 5 different horses, 3 domestic pigs, 1 dog, and most fascinating of all, 3 human specimens, an adult male, an adult female, and a child of unspecified gender. What's even more fascinating than the efficacy of these ants in attacking all different kinds of prey is their deftness at mimicking the behavior of their hosts. This isn't a reconstructive maggot situation. See our video on that nightmare for further information. The ants attempt to make their hosts actually act like the creatures they once were. The Foundation were astonished to see that the 3 human suits seemed to actually go through the motions of running the farm, watering the livestock, dispensing feed, moving other SCP-2031 colonies from one pasture to another. The human child suit would even spend extensive time playing with the dog suit, engaging in games such as fetch or mock wrestling. How the SCP-2031 colonies are able to do this is unknown. Working theories include rigorous observation of their targets before colonization, and the colony hive mind somehow picking up residual thoughts or muscle memory from their victims. Non-anomalous ants introduced to the SCP-2031 colonies also begin exhibiting anomalous traits, so the effects may somehow be contagious. One of the most fascinating moments of all came when the structural integrity of the dog suit finally gave out, leading to its colony exiting the body and returning to more nomadic behavior typical of army ants in search of a new host. The strange part was that the human suits actually seemed to grieve for the deceased dog suit, with the child suit becoming somewhat distressed that their playmate was suddenly gone. The 2 human suits even took the carcass of the dog suit and buried it in another pasture. It was unlike anything the Foundation had observed with SCP-2031 before. At what point did mimicry become sincere behavior? Because now SCP-2031 was seriously blurring the lines. It is in the best interest of the Foundation to keep this little ant farm going, both to keep SCP-2031 distracted from venturing further and causing trouble, and to further study the fascinating behaviors and dynamics exhibited by SCP-2031 colonies in captivity. One of the researchers has already put in a request for a new golden retriever. Take a brief moment to think back to your younger years, spending long, tiresome hours trapped in a classroom, waiting to hear the noise of that final bell of the day. That sound meant freedom, the end of another grueling 6 hours at your desk, and the chance to get back to the warm sanctuary of home. If you were lucky, you might not have had to go far to get back to the safety and security of being in your parents' house. Living close enough to the school would mean you could easily walk home when the day was through. But your classmates? Well, they weren't all as lucky. Some of them had miles to travel, all the way across town even. Fortunately though, the school bus would always be waiting outside at the end of each day, ready to take a gaggle of rowdy kids back home. And if you were one of those kids that had to take the bus, you'll know that the trip home after school was hardly a calm drive. Paper planes and spitballs firing from all directions, wads of chewing gum stuck to the undersides of seats, other kids all around you screaming and yelling at the top of their lungs. Still, it could be worse, right? No, trust us, it could be much, much worse than you can ever imagine. What if one day, the bus that picked you up from school wasn't a bus at all? What if instead, it was SCP-2086? Picture this. One day you get put in detention at school. Maybe you were disrupting a class, or were caught spraying graffiti on the outside wall of the gym. Whatever the reason, we're sure you'll think it is unfair that you got held back after school, after everyone else had already gone home. But you do your time until finally you're told you can leave. Problem is, your house is on the other side of town, and you've already missed the bus. You make your way off the campus, down the nearest street. Maybe there's a city bus you can catch that'll get you back home. As you stroll away from your school, you realize that the nearest bus stop, the first one on the route home, seems to be further away than you remember it being. Must be just the exhaustion of a long day getting the better of you, playing tricks on your mind. It's not like someone could move the bus stop, right? Finally reaching the stop, you notice lights coming down the street after a few moments of waiting quietly. A late bus, just like you hoped for. It pulls up to the next stop, the doors folding open to allow you on board. It's totally empty, save for the driver, but straight away you notice there's something odd about him. He seems drained of color. His movements are weird, more like a puppet on strings than an actual living, breathing human being. Now that you think about it, if it wasn't for the fact he was clearly moving, driving the bus, you might assume that he was a corpse. Then again, maybe he just had a long day too. Taking a seat, you try not to think about it and stare out of the window in boredom. You watch as the route takes you past stop after stop, all of them empty just like the bus itself. But then something unexpected happens. You've ridden the bus to and from school so many times before that you can't help but notice when, for some reason, it takes a wrong turn. Looking out the window, you know you aren't mistaken. The driver has changed direction. Instead of heading towards the nearest stop to home, he's taken the bus towards the furthest edge of town. Desperately, you try yelling at him, asking why he's taken the wrong turn, but the driver stays still, as if he can't even hear what you're saying. That's when you notice the smell. You didn't catch it before, but now it's all around you, filling the air inside the bus. It's almost like the scent of disinfectant. The bus now smells the same way a hospital does. But that's not all. The more you breathe it in, the more you feel yourself starting to get woozy, arms and legs getting heavier. Everything around you feels as if it's spinning uncontrollably. Out of the windows, you can just about make out the site of a junkyard, blurring in and out of focus. It's meant to be abandoned, and yet you're sure you can see movement. Massive, indeterminate shapes shifting around in the dark. Finally, your vision goes dark and you fall unconscious onto the floor of the bus. Only, you were never on the bus to begin with. No. Although you didn't know it, you were prey to something that just looked like a bus. SCP-2086. And now that it's caught you, you'll never see the light of day again. Now, SCP-2086 doesn't just refer to a single creature, not by a long shot. It is the designation given to an entire species of arthropods. Think lobsters, crabs, and spiders, or insects like centipedes and millipedes, only much bigger. To the untrained eye, and depending on when you look, an instance of SCP-2086 will normally look like any ordinary public transport vehicle, of any make and model, or belonging to any company or transit authority. Usually, though, they look like regular old buses, at least while they're out foraging for food. When born, an SCP-2086 specimen will grow to full juvenile size within a week, usually weighing 200 kilograms or less. Full matured adult instances, however, can weigh approximately 17,000 kilograms. The adults are the ones that go out foraging, leaving the nest to collect food to then bring back to the juvenile SCP-2086s. And by food, we of course mean humans. While out on the roads, matured SCP-2086 creatures are practically identical to the auto vehicles that form their bodies. But the materials that this disguise is made from, the steel, plastic, wood, and glass, they're all actually comprised of specialized chitin, the kind of outer shell you'd find on most arthropods. But underneath that outer shell, that's where you'll find the real horror. Within the main chamber, beneath the flooring of the bus's long inner portion, is stored the pulsing, beating heart of an SCP-2086 specimen. And we don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. If you were to lift up the floorboards of one of these bus-like creatures, you'd see its heart, along with other vital organs like the creature's brain and stomach. What's more, the figure in the front seat that you thought was a living, breathing bus driver actually isn't living or breathing, not anymore. Preserved in a shell-like substance that the creature is able to produce, the driver is actually a human corpse, acting as a decoy for SCP-2086s. From within the bus body, fibrous appendages reach up into the corpse, almost like incredibly thin hairs. The creature can then use the cadaver essentially as a puppet with a dead person's body. That's how an SCP-2086 is able to move its driver around, making it appear more lifelike so it can lure its prey aboard. Think of it like the bioluminescent light that an anglerfish uses to tempt unsuspecting fish into their jaws. Same principle, but with a dramatically different result when it comes to SCP-2086. But if you thought bus creatures with internal organs under the floor and dead meat puppets in the driver's seat weren't creepy enough, there's still much more to SCP-2086s than meets the eye. For example, when they aren't out foraging, the adult creatures can unravel the roof of their bus-shaped outer shell. Underneath is a pair of wings, large enough and strong enough to carry their entire 7,000 kilos of weight off the ground and up into the air. As for eyes, the headlights at the front are, in actual fact, bioluminescent optical organs, allowing the creatures to see their prey even in the dark. Still not horrifying enough? Well, would knowing about their legs help? The wheels underneath an SCP-2086 specimen are also capable of unraveling, forming long gray or black legs like those of a spider. Yes, these are bus creatures with wings and multi-jointed legs. These legs aren't just big, clumsy appendages either. Compared with other arthropods, SCP-2086s are able to use their limbs to perform surprisingly intricate actions and finer levels of manipulations. For instance, a number of specimens have been observed in the wild by the SCP Foundation building shelters out of any materials that they can find near their nesting ground. And where do they normally nest? Wherever there's plenty of scrap metal and hardly any people to notice them. Junkyards are the preferred habitats of SCP-2086s and where they will normally establish their colonies. While the juveniles remain within the confines of the colony, adult SCP-2086 specimens will leave to collect humans. Although on occasion, the younger specimens have been known to travel out from their nest and rearrange or relocate signposts for bus stops. They then place them in a route that leads them back towards their nesting ground. It's something worth remembering if your nearest bus stop ever seems to be a little further away from the school than usual. Afterward, the older specimens will travel along the route laid out by the juvenile SCP-2086s, picking up any human passengers that they find waiting at the relocated bus stops. They have to choose their moments wisely, with people boarding and disembarking from the bus usually every few stops. Once an SCP-2086 has as many humans on board as it can carry, with the certainty it won't lose any at the upcoming stop, it secretes a substance similar to chloroform. This fills the inner chamber of the bus, causing that noxious smell, like hospital disinfectant. The chloroform-like substance incapacitates all the passengers on board, rendering them unconscious and readying them to be taken back to the local SCP-2086 colony. Once the adult SCP-2086 has arrived at the junkyard, the juveniles will descend on it. Given their much smaller size, they will climb inside the mature specimen and forcibly remove each and every human passenger it is carrying within. Then comes the truly nasty part, feeding time. Each juvenile SCP-2086 will force their captive human through an orifice that is located under the front hood of their vehicle's shell. This sphincter, a circular formation of muscle that can expand and contract to perform a bodily function, is connected to where the steering wheel is found on an adult SCP-2086. The younger creatures will push their human prey through the sphincter, consuming them. Once this has occurred, those hairy appendages in the driver's seat will then latch onto the body of the now dead human, piercing through their skin, winding up and around their bones. These are the same fibrous hairs used to puppet the deceased corpse and use it to lure others aboard the bus. But these appendages have another function. They're feeding tubes. They will drain every last drop of blood from the SCP-2086's prey until the body is little more than a husk, at which point the tubes inject a saline solution directly into the cadaver. Afterwards, the inside of the bus fills with that same substance that preserves the corpse, and the process is complete. As horrifying as these creatures are, one of the few upsides of SCP-2086s is that they don't live very long. Female specimens will reproduce after 8 days and produce 20 offspring after this point. Each of these newborns reaches full maturity and size in about a week. On average, SCP-2086s live for 12 to 15 days. Another net positive is, because of their short lifespans, an SCP-2086 specimen doesn't need to feed on a human more than once, as the nutrients it absorbs as a juvenile are enough to sustain it through adulthood. Once it has matured, an SCP-2086 will go out into the nearest city or town to forage for humans, providing food to the next generation. And so the cycle continues. In the future, rather than taking the bus, maybe it's safer to walk. It might mean the difference between you making it home or becoming food. Now and again, you might stumble across an entry in the SCP Foundation archive that is far more than meets the eye. As you are probably already aware, sometimes the Foundation's numerical SCP designations can be referencing an entity, a creature, an object, a location, or even a combination of linked anomalies all sharing a version of the same number. Such is partially the case with SCP-4812. In this instance, the designation number 4812 doesn't refer to one singular item or entity. Instead, it is more of a collective designation, an umbrella term for 3 distinct, separate, but connected anomalies. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, so without further ado, let's take a look at SCP-4812, better known collectively as Wrath. We'll begin in a cavern deep beneath Alais in the south of France, where we find the first of the entities to share the designation SCP-4812. This creature, large and without its own distinct form, is referred to as SCP-4812-S. It possesses a number of long appendages that protrude from its amorphous body, each one covered in a sticky adhesive, a sort of glue-like substance. In addition, each appendage, as well as the rest of SCP-4812-S's body, is covered in fine hair that is also hydrophobic, meaning that it does not absorb water, and in fact actively repels it. These tendrils extend deep into the walls of the cavern surrounding the creature. SCP-4812-S also has an inherent latent ability to affect anyone that visually perceives it. In other words, look upon this creature at your own peril. And we don't mean that looking at it will drive you mad. The fact is that nobody has been able to look directly at this creature without suffering a horrific, grisly death. Upon taking even the quickest glimpse of SCP-4812-S, the person observing will suffer the same effect they would if their eyes, brain, and entire nervous system had been dipped in caustic acid. Yes, this creature instantly melts down on a molecular level anyone who is brave enough or foolish enough to directly look at it. That means a pain unlike any you could imagine. Bleeding through the skin and all orifices, paralysis, asphyxiation, and then death in that order. Humans cannot directly interact with the creature unless it is submerged in total darkness, where they cannot perceive it visually. The anomalous hazard of this entity even extends to photos or video recordings of SCP-4812-S. However, the effect is not as immediate or violent when someone just looks at an image or video of it. Still, you might want to check that your brain isn't melting after this video is over, just to be safe. Beyond killing anyone that sees it, SCP-4812-S does very little, staying quite still in its cave behind the maximum security doors the Foundation has put in place at the entrance. So that's our first of the SCP-4812s. Who's next? How about SCP-4812-E, an approximately 15-meter-tall humanoid made of platinum? This entity appears vaguely skeletal, with traces of tungsten and other metal compounds in its composition. SCP-4812-E remains at a constant body temperature of 0.0000000031 Kelvin, or almost negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit. However, this entity can also absorb the heat around it without changing its own temperature, reducing a cell at room temperature to absolute zero in around 16 seconds flat. And it's because of this that SCP-4812-E is often surrounded by a layer of frozen air and water. Much like the other creature it shares a designation with, close interactions with SCP-4812-E are often deadly. Stand too close and the air around you would drop in temperature rapidly. The water within your body would freeze, and in seconds, you would die. Even with the use of a specially insulated suit, you would be lucky to gain a few short moments of added protection. The only thing that weakens SCP-4812-E's effect is to expose it to extreme heat, although this does not stop the temperature absorption entirely, just slows it. But it's through the constant application of high temperatures that the Foundation has been able to keep SCP-4812-E contained in a thermally controlled vault kept intensely hot at all times. Finally, we have the last of the three, designated as SCP-4812-K, and we recommend anyone with a bug phobia to look away now. This creature is an enormous winged insect, almost like a cross between a stag beetle and a scorpion in some of the physical traits it shares with them, while its size might be significantly bigger, measuring 180 meters long. The insect possesses 2 large pinchers, 4 legs, 4 wings that extend from its back, and a long segmented tail with a pointed barb at the tip. Yes, this creepy crawly would need a lot more than just a can of Raid to get rid of it. But perhaps most strangely of all is SCP-4812-K's face. Not the typical insect eyes and mouth you would expect. but the face of a human male. Much like its cavern-dwelling counterpart, SCP-4812-K tends to not do all that much when left alone. It can usually be found flying through the upper stratosphere, only really moving when it flaps its wings. You might have a hard time trying to spot it though, as its body is coated in reflected chitin. In other words, the bug's exoskeleton refracts light away from it and makes it almost invisible. While the SCP Foundation has made attempts to secure and contain this gigantic flying insect after they learned of its existence, the creature's sheer size and strength have destroyed any fighter jets or drones they have sent after it. It seems impervious to damage from conventional weapons, with anything fired at it being almost perfectly reflected and directed back towards the shooter. All the Foundation can really do is hope that nobody else spots it and keeps a close eye on SCP-4812-K through regular surveillance. Above all though, one procedure remains consistent and all of the utmost importance with every aspect of SCP-4812. Never, under any circumstances, can any of them be allowed to interact with the other two. So what could possibly connect these three creatures? An amorphous entity that kills anyone who looks at it. A giant humanoid male made of platinum that alters temperature without absorbing heat. And a winged insect that is almost perfect at reflecting anything around it. They all seem to be pretty disconnected. Yet their common thread must be pretty significant for all three to share the title of SCP-4812. Indeed, if they had no relation to each other, they could each have their own unique number. And what is the mysterious fourth redacted entity that is also referred to as SCP-4812? The answers to this multitude of questions aren't exactly straightforward. Still, there does exist a series of anomalous documents and items that the Foundation has recovered that feature some of the necessary information. Recovered from Marcus de Wees, a Dutch collector of anomalous artifacts. These items are referred to as the Connington set, named after Winston J. Connington, an English archaeologist and occultist whose research led the Foundation to the discovery of a number of SCPs. Among the various artifacts of the Connington set is a journal kept by Connington himself, featuring depictions of the different SCP-4812 creatures and notes recording his findings. The set also features 3 hefty tomes written in German over the course of many years that contain multiple archaic coordinates. In one, an edition in Italian by another author seems to shed a little light on SCP-4812. The translation of this section tells of an ancient kingdom, respected above all others, known either as the House of Apollyon or the Sky Kings of Old Europe. The first ruler of this kingdom was allegedly a descendant of the King of Crimson Skies, or Asem, the First Man. These Sky Kings ruled over what is now modern-day Europe for 100 generations, conquering all who opposed them. Among their adversaries were those faithful to the Iron God, presumably the Mechanites, the ancient machine-worshipping religion that preceded the Church of the Broken God. Eventually, however, complacency reared its ugly head, and Sky King Sarus VIII von Apollyon looked beyond the realms of men, hoping to find new land to conquer. Sarus VIII assembled his forces, the largest army ever seen, and set his sights on the lands of the Fair Folk, more commonly known as fairies nowadays. These fair folk were already engaged in conflict with their southern neighbors, the Children of the Moon, and were drastically underprepared for Sarus's approaching forces. Within 2 weeks, the fairies were scattered, driven from their lands. There was, however, a sole survivor, a Fey princess, who was captured and faced the grim fate of being taken as a trophy. But the princess had other plans. While being taken back to the Sky King's domain, she cast a curse upon the House of Apollyon, and Sarus VIII in particular. A horrific storm swept the returning ships as the Fey princess prayed to an ancient, nameless god for vengeance against her people's conquerors. According to legend, the chains that had her shackled to Sarus's ship caught fire, and the blaze spread until it had burned the Sky King's ship to ash. It has even been said that the same chains then wrapped around Sarus himself, dragging him down into the ocean's depths. Then, to defend against any further dark magic from the remaining fair folk, Sarus IX appointed 4 kings to defend his kingdom. By now you might still be wondering what any of this has to do with SCP-4812, but don't worry, we're getting there, we promise. So as the story continues, the remaining ships were still able to bring the Fey princess back, and she was brought before Sarus's heir, Sarus IX von Apollyon, who imprisoned her for what she had done. The princess was sent into a sealed dungeon deep beneath the oceans. This prison is heavily implied to be the first of the SCP-4812 entities, better known to us as SCP-4812-S. However, the explanations of the heat-sink platinum humanoid and the reflective flying insect are a little harder to decipher from Winston J. Connington's journal. While most of Connington's notes are written in a cipher, a few sections have been translated. According to him, from her prison deep below the earth, the voice of the fairy princess was able to communicate with the souls of the 4 knights protecting Saurus IX's kingdom. As a result, the Sky King was forced to banish them, and this brought forth what Connington referred to as the Great Profanities. Without the knights' defense, some force known as the Vinivinex, the first profanity was able to cast its cold hand over Saurus's only daughter, killing her. A creature whose presence can drain the heat from a person? Sounds an awful lot like SCP-4812-E, huh? In retaliation for his daughter's death, Saurus drew up an ancient spear called the Godless Lance and struck the being down, casting it into the Earth's molten core and subduing SCP-4812-E with the intense heat below. Another section describes the King of Many Faces, Lamenolant, the creature we know as SCP-4812-K. Connington's findings describe this entity's slaughter of the Deva, a neighboring kingdom. The enormous insect appeared from the space beyond spaces and would deflect perfectly any attack made against it, before taking the faces of the Deva and returning to the skies. But there was one final profanity, known only as the Profane Dark. The legend continues with this profanity, a dark black smear rising from the graves of the fair folk. It soaked through the earth and burst from below, claiming the Sky King and dragging him into the endless void. As it pulled him away, Saurus cursed the Profane Dark, calling it Yash, the last great foe of man. Watching his kingdom fall without the protection of his 4 knights, all the Sky King could utter was one repeated word: wrath. Our disgusting tale of anomalous nastiness begins in the humble town of Beckley, West Virginia, back in the 1990s. It was 10 a.m. on a hot day in early August, as Oscar Doug was winding his way through the wooded roads and back streets of town. He isn't the villain of our story, he's just a man doing his very unglamorous job, cleaning up roadkill for the local government. Plenty of woodland critters meet their ends against the wheels and bumpers of careless drivers, and it was thanks to the tireless work of people like Oscar Doug that the fine roads of rural America aren't piled high with carcasses. Of course, Oscar was used to seeing some unpleasant things on the job, but nothing like this. When he began pulling over to the side of the lonely street to pick up a dead deer, he was shocked to see a sudden flash of stark white illuminated by his headlights. It was a naked human woman crouched over the deer carcass. She was sucking at the exposed red flesh on the deer's flank, as though feeding off of it. Flies circled around her in the hot summer air. The smell emerging from the deer carcass was unspeakable, but the woman didn't even seem to care. She just fed away with a crazed look in her eye. And even more disturbing was the fact that he recognized her. It was Mrs. Faber, a local eccentric who lived with her husband on a farm just outside of town. Or at least, she had. You see, Oscar Doug had never met Mrs. Faber in person before. He only recognized her from the missing person flyers posted around town. He pulled out his cell phone to call the authorities, when suddenly Mrs. Faber was startled by something and fled into the woods. This would be the first of many encounters reported by townsfolk concerning Mrs. Faber, or more specifically, the anomalous species that was once Mrs. Faber, and is now designated SCP-726. Mrs. Faber practically became a local cryptid, similar to that of Sasquatch or the Loch Ness Monster, with sightings of her in the woods and around town frequently being reported by the locals. Of course, Mr. Faber was beside himself about the whole situation. What was happening to his beloved wife? People assumed a psychotic break or some kind of sudden onset of acute dementia. She had to be apprehended and brought in for her own good before she caused harm to herself or others. And on August 16th, she was finally found and captured. Mrs. Faber was found in the dumpster of a local diner with a large dog. After being subdued, she was sent to a nearby hospital. Her condition had seemingly advanced to the point where she was no longer even capable of speech. However, if it had ended there, the SCP Foundation wouldn't have been called in. It would have just been a sad local story of a woman who became very unwell. But that was only the beginning to the true strangeness behind SCP-726. Random livestock, like cows and pigs, were found across the town, behaving incredibly bizarre, exhibiting actions and traits uncommon of their respective species. And the most shocking of all was that the sightings of Mrs. Faber around town still didn't stop, despite her being actively held by a local hospital. Naturally, that's when the SCP Foundation decided to take control of the situation. They dispatched field agents to properly investigate and figure out what was going on in Beckley, West Virginia. That's when they discovered a peculiar commonality: maggots. You see, the behavior exhibited by the strange animals and by Mrs. Faber was not consistent with their own species, but they were incredibly consistent with the behaviors of the common botfly, a particularly unpleasant form of fly that sometimes lays its eggs in the bodies of still living animals. The anomalously affected entities exhibited insectoid movements, an affinity for rotting meat, and even strange shifting of the back muscles, suggesting the gesture of flapping wings that weren't there. But what was going on here? Was this mind control, or something more insidious? As it turned out, the key to unlocking this mystery was in the dumpster that Mrs. Faber was found in. An entire pig was found inside the dumpster, exhibiting the same strange behaviors as the other anomalous animals. But not long before it was transformed into a pig, it was simply a half-eaten hot dog thrown to waste in the garbage. This miraculous transformation came courtesy of SCP-726, now also known as the Reconstructive Maggots. Much like regular maggots, these creatures are attracted to decaying flesh and will multiply and consume dead bodies or rotten food rapidly. However, the truly strange thing is what happens afterward. The maggots will expel purified waste matter, which then reconstitutes back into a kind of living, exact clone of the entity it once was. Well, exact in a physical sense. In a psychological sense, these clones are exactly like a mature botfly. The maggots that reconstitute these bodies die off almost immediately, but whenever two of these clones mate, with reproductive behavior often being inspired by the presence of carcasses or spoilt meat, they produce more eggs, which in turn release SCP-726 maggots and begin the cycle all over again. And fascinatingly, these maggots can reconstitute an entire clone from even a portion of the original creature. Which begs the question, why were there seemingly multiple Mrs. Fabers sighted in and around the town of Beckley, West Virginia? Upon further investigation into Mrs. Faber and her husband, a terrible secret came to light. Mr. Faber had murdered his wife in a fit of rage and cut up her body before burying the pieces around the grounds of his home. Unbeknownst to him, an infestation of SCP-726 maggots across the property ate each piece and reconstituted them into individual fly-brained clones of the original. Mr. Faber was later arrested for the murder, and multiple people in the town of Beckley were given amnestic treatment to forget the strange and frightening things they'd seen. But for the Foundation, the strange and frightening things were only just beginning. An unnamed doctor with the SCP Foundation decided to conduct a series of utterly repulsive experiments on SCP-726, opening the log with the fateful words, "I've decided to begin by testing the limits of repeated replication. A single SCP-726 egg will be introduced per sample. Due to their rapid multiplication, maggot volume does not affect their speed of operation, only the size of the organism to be reconstructed." The first subject was a recently deceased Norwegian rat, cut in half lengthwise. When the SCP-726 eggs were introduced, the two halves were rapidly constituted into a pair of living rats with mirrored fur patterns. Both of these rats were then ground into a fine paste and mixed. Wondering if SCP-726 would create a hybrid, they did not, instead separating the mix into two piles and once again creating two rats, nearly identical to the ones before, except for one of them now having a red right eye. The rat without the red right eye was processed into a fine paste, get used to hearing that phrase, before the introduction of more SCP-726 samples. It reproduced a close approximation of the rat it once was, aside from a slight limp and blindness in both eyes. The heart was then taken from this rat, and upon the introduction of SCP-726 into the heart, it was reconstituted without eyes or any pigmentation. A note also mentions that the creature squeaked incessantly. The heart from this rat was then taken and cut in half before SCP-726 was introduced. The result was a pair of even more severely messed up eyeless rats. One could only walk in tight circles, and the other immediately attacked the first rat. The doctor noted that both physiology and insect behavior seemed to degrade with repeated reconstitutions of the same genetic material. Next, a scrap of flesh was taken from the hairless rat. The creature that reconstituted from this was hairless, eyeless, and limbless, and didn't successfully survive for long. A liver was found inside its brain case. But because this particular researcher hadn't spit in the face of God enough for one day, the tests continued. The liver from the brainless rat was given a dose of SCP-726, and the result was an eyeless, legless, limbless creature with a long, worm-like midsection, which quickly began to devour its own posterior before dying of blood loss. This dead rat was then put through 3 more iterations of testing. It first became a large, formless mass of tissue, and then a long, slug-like creature that takes in nutrients through its skin. After this, no more changes were recorded, as it had presumably reached its peak performance. The scientists decided to keep this creature for long-term observation, naming it Brundle, after the scientists in David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly. At this point, the doctor began to conduct tests that, mercifully, did not involve any more rats. Instead, the Foundation moved on to humans. Dried flesh from a body that's over 2,000 years old was given to SCP-726, leading to a full reconstitution of a middle-aged man with the mind of a fly, opening doors to potential practical forensic applications of SCP-726. Humans seem to experience a similar degree of form degradation after multiple reconstitutions from the same genetic material. But due to humans being larger and more complex organisms, the changes are often less pronounced, like changes in eye color or fingerprints. While the forensic use of SCP-726 is an open door, clones produced by SCP-726 are worthless for both medical and food purposes. During one experiment, SCP-726 was used to replace a missing chunk of a wounded D-Class's leg. This appeared to be successful at first, until the D-Class later experienced a rapid mental devolution into a fly-like state, just like the other victims of SCP-726. The D-Class was terminated, and the test was recorded as a failure. It's believed that a similar thing would happen if organ transplants were taken out of SCP-726 clones and given to non-anomalous donors. SCP-726 was used to clone several livestock animals, such as cows and pigs. Food items like steaks were rendered from these animals, cooked and given to D-Classes. Much like the transplants, this led to a similar state of devolution for those who ate the infected meat. Even when the meat was thoroughly disinfected and processed, the anomalous effects remained. So no, SCP-726 won't be ending world hunger anytime soon. Though if it gave us all the minds of flies through tainted meat, it may at least end all global warfare, seeing as flies don't have the mental capacity to create or wield weapons. At this point, it seemed that the researcher was just curious and felt like trying some other random experiments just for the heck of it, like getting SCP-726 to reconstitute a non-anomalous botfly, leading to the clone simply being an unusually large botfly which died shortly thereafter, or testing a burger patty from a local independent drive-thru restaurant that reconstituted into 2 different cows and 1 large rat. Yummy. But the most horrifying result of all came when they tested SCP-726 on what was supposedly a vegan burger, made entirely out of artificial meat and plant matter. The resulting creatures were so unimaginably horrifying they literally cannot be described. Even hardened SCP Foundation researchers were driven to scream and vomit at the mere sight of them. One of these creatures was killed and ground into fine paste before SCP-726 was introduced again. Somehow, this resulted in something even worse. A truly horrifying, unkillable entity on par with SCP-682. Even when they liquefied the beast, it kept attacking. They could only stop it by freezing it and keeping it on ice. Testing into SCP-726 was suspended shortly thereafter. Maggots, spotflies, and rat paste. How lovely. If you were eating during any of this, well, you only have yourself to blame. When an anomaly is first detected by an SCP Foundation field agent, it's up to the Foundation's mobile task forces to tag and bag the impossible entities before they can do any more harm. Sometimes these retrievals are uneventful, other times, not so much. Especially when they're dealing with brutal forces of nature like SCP-096. Also known as the Shy Guy, a creature that, from the very first interaction with the Foundation, had a reputation for being dangerous and needed to be feared. A series of vague sightings and mysterious disappearances up in the frosty mountains of the Yukon first sparked the Foundation's interest. When they were certain that they had an anomaly on their hands, 2 retrieval teams, Zulu 9A and Zulu 9B, were dispatched to secure and contain the entity. Zulu 9A took the lead in a heavy-duty chopper, equipped with 50 caliber GAU-19 heavy machine guns, and carrying an AT-4 anti-tank launcher. They were prepared for anything, or so they thought, as they established a visual on SCP-096 while 2 clicks away from the target. They couldn't get a clear line of sight on the creature, but it appeared to be stationary, docile, and was making no attempt to flee. Piece of cake, right? Little did they know that SCP-096 was just looking away from them. If it was facing towards them, it'd be a whole different horror story, as Zulu 9A were about to find out. The team landed their helicopter next to the creature and were shocked to see that it was completely naked, in spite of the sub-zero temperatures all around them. The creature was unnaturally thin, as though it had been starved for weeks, with bone-white skin and unnaturally long limbs. The team guessed that the creature's arms must have been at least 1.5 meters long, but its docile nature and insubstantial body mass gave the impression that it wouldn't prove too difficult to contain. That is, until they saw its face. Zulu 9A's captain was the lone survivor of the incident, as he was lucky enough to be looking away when the creature turned towards his team. The rest of the squad ended up staring eye to eye with SCP-096, and from that moment on, wasn't docile anymore. The creature began to whimper, then cry, then sob uncontrollably in a way that sounded eerily human. This sudden change in temperament startled the rest of Zulu 9A, and they opened fire on the creature. Under the hail of gunfire, SCP-096 entered a murderous frenzy and began tearing into the hapless squad of soldiers. While its flesh and organs did seem to take damage as a result of the barrage of 50 caliber rounds from the helicopter-mounted machine guns, its skeletal structure remained intact, and it continued its onslaught, tearing the team limb from limb, even after they'd blown practically all the flesh from the creature. The AT-4 anti-tank launcher proved equally ineffective at stopping SCP-096 while it was in attack mode. And it was only after slaughtering the entire team that it returned to its docile state. Nobody knows exactly what the creature did to Zulu 9A after the gunfire started, but no trace of the team was left behind. Zulu 9B touched down soon after, and with a grave warning from the captain not to look at the creature's face, they were finally able to subdue it. A bag was placed over SCP-096's face, which seemed to soothe it enough to move it to a nearby Foundation facility. Little did they know, they just obtained one of the deadliest SCPs of all time. And while it may have been under lock and key for now, it seemed inevitable that it would get out and cause more violence and chaos. Research and containment procedures for the SCP-096 were put under the command of Dr. Dan, a senior researcher at the site. It was his job to find out exactly what this being was capable of. The more he tested, the more he realized that they were dealing with something truly terrifying. Disposable D-Class personnel were used to figure out exactly what it was that caused the creature to enter its attack mode. Just as it had during the initial retrieval mission, SCP-096 went berserk when any of the attending personnel saw its face. In this stage, it would enter a period of considerable and unstoppable distress for 1 to 2 minutes, covering its face and wailing loudly. When the period of distress ended, the creature would mercilessly slaughter every D-class that had seen its face, and just like with Zulu 9A, no trace of their bodies would be left behind. Dr. Den was horrified and intrigued by this phenomenon. The creature killed anyone that saw its face directly, but could the same be said for indirect depictions of the creature's face, such as images and videos? Dr. Dan was desperate to find out. More D-Class personnel were brought in to test this, to frightening results. Dr. Dan found that the creature did indeed still enter attack mode when people saw pictures and videos of SCP-096's face. The creature seemed to have an innate sense of when people were viewing these representations, even when it should have had no conceivable way of knowing. It didn't matter how far away or how many barriers were in place between the viewer and the creature, the attack mode would still activate. And once it did, it seemed as though nothing could stop the creature from hunting down the one who saw its face. With all of this new data, special containment procedures were devised to keep the creature safely under lock and key. Its cell was a 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter airtight steel cube, fitted with advanced pressure sensors and laser detectors to ensure that SCP-096 remained in its cell without risking anyone having visual contact with the creature's face. All cameras and video equipment were strictly forbidden, and weekly checks for any cracks or holes in the containment cell were mandatory. Of course, none of this would stop the creature if anyone somehow saw its face. In order to solve that little problem, Dr. Dan would need to continue his research. To find a method of subverting the creature's deadly glance, they needed to know exactly what they were dealing with. But how could they, when even a glance at a photo or video of the being meant certain death? A potential solution was proposed, creating an artistic representation of the creature's face, something that hadn't yet been attempted. But how would they achieve such a feat? Simple. They'd procure a D-Class prisoner with some artistic talent, and they found one who had been a tattoo artist before becoming a Foundation guinea pig. Dr. Dan formulated an ingenious plan for keeping this D-Class alive for long enough to accurately draw an image of SCP-096's face. He would be placed in a bathysphere diving bell several kilometers underwater and tens of kilometers away from the containment cell where the SCP was being held. The D-Class was made to look at a photograph of the creature's face and then replicate that image in a pencil sketch. Dr. Dan first confirmed that the creature's attack mode is only activated by the creature's face, by having the D-Class look at a series of photos of the SCP's body parts, one by one, finally finishing with its face. The D-Class began drawing and even remarked on how creepy the SCP's facial features were, despite not knowing the deadly context. Meanwhile, back in its containment cell, SCP-096 sensed someone viewing its face and entered its inconsolable crying state followed by its attack mode. It broke out of containment easily and began making a beeline for the D-Class, traversing the miles between it and its prey. The D-Class didn't know it, as he locked the finished drawing into a separate, autonomous submersible, but he was already dead. As the drawing made its way up to a researcher on the surface, SCP-096 dived into the water and started swimming down towards the artist. Minutes later, the bathysphere was breached, and the D-Class was torn to shreds. SCP-096 was recaptured without issue by Surface Recovery Team Foxtrot 303A, and further testing on the drawing showed that artistic representations of SCP-096's face were in fact harmless. From this experience, we now know that the creature has a gaunt face with totally white eyes, possibly indicating blindness and a grossly extended jaw. Nevertheless, Dr. Dan was adamant that SCP-096 was too dangerous to be left alive, and requested permission from the upper echelons of the Foundation to terminate the creature by any means necessary. However, the doctor's request would fall on deaf ears, until it all started with a seemingly innocent image. While it's now been redacted for your safety, the black speck inside the yellow circle was once a minuscule image of SCP-096, taken unknowingly in the 1990s by a semi-professional mountaineer. One day they were looking at old photographs when his eyes passed over the tiny speck without even noticing that he had seen anything. But SCP-096 noticed and began entering its attack mode. It tore through its steel containment unit like tissue paper, causing the release of a nerve agent that killed a number of attending Foundation staff. The monster then fled the base and began pursuing its prey, with Mobile Task Force Tau-1 in hot pursuit. Dr. Alexei, who was helping to manage the site where the SCP was contained, was in dismay over the situation. Dr. Dan was out of the country at the time, trying to discover more about the creature's origins. However, he did leave the mobile task force with a new secret weapon against the rampaging Shy Guy. Project Scramble. Scramble were state-of-the-art goggles featuring a new technology created by Dr. Dan, which, using artistic renditions of 096's facial features, could detect and scramble the features of SCP-096 into an unrecognizable form, preventing the normally deadly effect of gazing upon its face. In theory, this would allow MTF Tau-1 to engage safely with 096 once its prey had been eliminated and bring it back into containment. But disaster struck on two fronts. First, the prey in question was located in a population center, creating the potential for a huge loss of life. And the second bigger problem was that the scramble technology didn't work, as stray pixels of the creature's face would reach the eyes of the task force before the internal microprocessor had time to scramble them. The mission turned into a death sentence, as SCP-096 slaughtered almost the entire task force, as well as a number of civilians in town, including an infant and its entire family. It was a monumental disaster, made even worse by a final revelation. Dr. Dan and Dr. Alexei had themselves facilitated the entire containment breach and allowed the resulting massacre to happen, with Dr. Dan hoping it would be enough motivation for Foundation Command to greenlight his research into destroying the creature. Anything that would give him the opportunity to kill this thing would be worth the bloodshed. His plan worked, and the SCP Foundation saw it his way, approving his request to neutralize SCP-096. However, success comes at a cost for Dr. Dan. Once he figures out a way to finally kill the creature, though done in his line of duty, he himself will be terminated by the Foundation for his crimes against humanity. But considering how much damage SCP-096 is capable of causing if it ever got to a major population center, or even worse, was ever caught on camera and broadcast to a worldwide audience, the Doctor himself would likely deem his own death a justifiable cost. To this day, the Foundation is researching ways to kill the creature, and they're still looking for their silver bullet. And the pressure is on. They hadn't known about the seemingly innocent picture that sparked the last containment breach, the one taken decades ago, in which the Shy Guy had only occupied 4 tiny pixels. 4 tiny pixels that resulted in multiple innocent lives lost. So be careful where you look, because who knows how many other photos of the creature are lurking out there. Photos with an innocent dot in the background. Your eyes glance over it, not even noticing the little blip, until you hear a distant wailing that seems to be getting closer and closer and closer, and then it's already too late. You edge the poolside, chlorine-stenched air filling your nose, the sound of splashing and lifeguards whistling bouncing off the indoor pool facility walls. The water ripples, family and friends egging you to cannonball in, the pool almost beckoning you to jump with its suggestive waves. Yet there remains an underlying fear, one that brings your hands to your face and causes your teeth to chatter, even as the pool, clear as glass with chlorine, hides no secrets. A monster, some teeth-gnashing megalodon ascending from the depths of extinction. Leviathan curling its barbed tail to strike its prey at any moment, or even some vast, unknowable force, ancient as Earth, hardly comprehensible to human minds, waiting, dreaming to breach the surface. No matter what form this gargantuan, invisible monster takes, you know one thing. Once you jump in, you will not return to shore. You take a moment, recompose yourself, and laugh off the fear. Maybe a product of too much research on the bloop, that deep ocean sound continuing to confound scientists as to its cause. Or maybe too much binging infographics videos on sea monsters, krakens and Loch Ness monsters, mysterious globsters cast onto shores throughout America. Whatever the origin, the thought seems ridiculous to you now, and your fears regarding invisible sharks stalking the pool perimeter escape your mind as you hurl yourself into the water. SCP-1128. In the vast archives of a hidden site, stuffed into a drawer amongst uncountable horrors like it, The SCP Foundation holds a description of a vast, unfathomable horror that'll make you more suspicious the next time you pass a pool, lake, or even a bathtub or puddle of water. SCP-1128 is a gigantic aquatic monster lurking in waters unknown, and that's all the Foundation will let anyone not assigned to testing know about it. While the Foundation has never shed away from those Moby Dicks of the deep, including the several thousand-kilometer-long arthropod SCP-169, and has even utilized such predators in the past for their own benefit, like the lengthy beast SCP-3000, SCP-1128 poses a unique challenge. Anyone who knows of its description beyond surface-level details will fall under the anomaly's effect. The representation you see now is merely an artist's interpretation of the basic prompt. The Foundation, of course, had to discover the monster's effects in the first place. The chain of communication becomes foggy, but a tip from an unknown source alerted the Foundation to the monster's existence and details regarding its manifestation. One man who had stumbled upon the entity's full description started developing acute thalassophobia, the fear of large bodies of water. Not bodies in the water, mind you. The man refused to relax on the beach or fly overseas, claiming he could see the monster's dark silhouette lurking underwater, ever scouting for him. This eventually extended to even closed bodies of water, like lakes, ponds, and pools, still insisting that the creature swam under the surface, trailing him wherever he went. His friends dismissed him as crazy, and he too believed he had fallen under some hysteria. He decided to take a nice, warm bath to soothe his mind and ease his troubles. He turned on the faucet and let the tub fill up. He put on his best bathing suit, ready to calm his anxiety once and for all. This had been plaguing his mind for far too long, and he was ready to rid all the negativity surrounding this phobia. Basically, he was sick and tired of being sick and tired over the idea of it all. He mustered up the courage, and with the anticipation to just simply relax, he took his first confident step into the tub. He paused for a moment and breathed a sigh of relief. He picked up his other foot and stepped fully into the bath. Splash! He fell straight down right through the tub. Waves and bubbles blocked his vision. His arms flailed as he sunk deeper into an abyss of water and fear. This wasn't supposed to happen, he thought. Several moments later, while still in a full-on panic, the buoyancy of his body began to slow his sinking. The bubbles from his underwater screams rose above him, and he began to follow their direction, scrambling back up to where he'd come. Just as he made it back to the surface of the tub water, choking and hyperventilating in terror, he swore he could see a distant creature, the very same that stalked him through oceans and pools, staring at him. Shaking, he hoisted himself out of the water and ran out of the house. Hysterical, he ran through the surrounding neighborhood, desperately searching for someone he could relay his experience to. Blinded by fear, he neglected to spot a puddle in the middle of the road he ran on. He raised his foot, arched forward, and landed straight into the seemingly shallow water. Splash! Again, he found himself completely submerged and drowning. After a minute, he did emerge from the puddle, but not in one piece. Knowledgeable of this incident, the Foundation set about expunging any traces of the monster's description from the world, physical and digital. The description had low distribution according to the results of Foundation web crawlers, but this hardly stopped the Foundation's endeavor. With forum posts deleted, individuals located and amnesticized, and catalogs trawled to ensure the description did not proliferate, the Foundation engaged in what it does best: questionably ethical experiments. First, they had an anonymous D-Class, uninformed of the creature's effect, read the description of the beast. While the pamphlet they gave him confused him somewhat, he didn't feel particularly frightened by the entity, and he confusedly put on the diving suit the Foundation testers provided him. As they connected him to a cable and told him to enter a bathtub, the D-Class did as they instructed him. The D-Class expressed initial confusion at the tub's depth, remarking that it looked so tiny from the outside. As the D-Class continued to descend, he analyzed his surroundings, realizing the nautical reality that enveloped him. He asked how an ocean got stuffed into a bathtub. but the test organizer had no room for miscellaneous talk. He continued to descend until he hit the sandy bottom, seaweed covering the ocean floor. The D-Class looked around. Tropical fish swam in schools, coral covered the seabed, and to his right dropped an immense cliff, a sheer edge. The test organizer advised the D-Class to approach the cliff, and he begrudgingly complied. As he struggled in his diving suit, he fell back and screamed. SCP-1128, the aquatic horror, swam distantly, gracefully even, and paid no attention to the D-Class so fixated upon it. He realized that the creature matched the one he read on the pamphlet, and almost complained about this when he saw a blue whale swimming alongside SCP-1128. Compared to the monster, the whale looked like a guppy. The whale glided in front of SCP-1128's jaws. The monster remained tranquil, stared at its prey, and bit the whale in two with one chaw. Its teeth glistened in the water. The test operator requested the D-Class to pull back, and as the cable began to draw him toward where he came, the D-Class stared at the creature, swallowing the chunks of whale whole. The D-Class's eyes remained fixated on the creature, partially in fright, partially in awe. He wondered how ocean trawlers hadn't discovered such a giant beast yet, with the world effectively under 100% surveillance, something the D-Class knew far too well as a convict. Yet the D-Class recognized, and if not comprehended, partially understood the ocean's vastness and mystery. The dark depths reveal no inkling as to their contents, and a creature like a giant squid or the coelacanth can remain in hiding for centuries, if not millennia. It held him in wondrous thought to consider the vastness of the depths. When SCP-1128 stopped and stared at the D-Class, this feeling of wonder was quickly replaced with fear. As the creature approached, the D-Class pleaded with the test operators for help. As the test operators accelerated the rate of the cable returning, the D-Class took short, shallow breaths, filling his body with dangerous nitrogen as he ascended, further impairing his judgment. He had devolved into gibberish and screaming when face to face, the monster consumed its prey. The cable went slack, and the test operator pulled up only a broken wire, snapped, the water turning a cloudy red. The test operator knew that the unprotected D-Class had no chance at survival against the monster, but he could potentially arm and shield them. He had another similarly ignorant D-Class once again dress in a scuba suit and enter the tub. However, the test operator placed the D-Class within a shark cage, a la the movie Jaws, and lowered the cage in with another cable and winch system. While unsure how this would fare with SCP-1128, the test operator remained hopeful that the D-Class could survive and recount his story. Unfortunately, as the cage lowered into the tub, the test operator received no response from the D-Class until the line spontaneously tightened, snapped, and loosened. Hoping to find the D-Class's remains, the test operator only found shredded pieces of metal, torn and twisted like taffy. The test operator decided that he could utilize the Foundation's arsenal to his advantage and used an anomalously toughened shark cage in his testing, perhaps using an anomaly like the clockwork machine SCP-914. He gained approval from his higher-ups to undergo this procedure, and after some testing, behind a shining, strong-as-titanium shark cage, which he placed another D-Class within. Hoping for a success with the monster, however, proved unsatisfactory, as the same thing happened as the previous test, only without any sort of metallic remains. While bitter that the monster had won again, he wondered where the cage had landed. Meanwhile, Foundation forces labored tirelessly to find SCP-1128's location, hoping to avoid any civilian contact with the creature. Luckily, a GPS signal established itself upon the most recent D-Class's test, with the tracking device on the D-Class signifying the monster's general location. The Foundation had redacted the location of the monster, perhaps in a vain attempt to hide a very near threat from potential readers. The Foundation set up a team of only the most talented boaters in its forces, Mobile Containment Force Kappa-12 Sea Devils. Upon arriving at the location, the Sea Devils discovered the previously enhanced shark cage, completely undamaged. However, closer inspection revealed traces of human DNA on the bars, though the Foundation could not confirm whether the DNA belonged to the previously sent D-Class. The test operator, while glad his shark cage survived the monster's attack, still found himself dissatisfied with the overall results of the test. He knew he needed to quell this creature's impact before a large population viewed it or knew of it. But the horrible beast had evaded all attempts at peaceful interaction. Perhaps with a madness not unlike Captain Ahab yearning for the death of his white whale, the test operator armed a D-Class with a specialized weapon designed to deal with aquatic threats promptly. This weapon, potentially another of the Foundation's precious arsenal, could potentially harm, if not kill, the creature. While he knew the Foundation's mission statement forbade unnecessary destruction, the test operator felt it may turn necessary if matters turn any worse. Thus, he sent his armed D-Class through the tub once more, ready to engage the beast in combat. The attempt, as one may expect, did not last long. The D-Class, upon spotting the creature, aimed his weapon at the monster and attacked it, but rather than drive the creature away, it only turned intently upon the D-Class, as if it desired a fight. The D-Class barely managed to scrape SCP-1128 before the creature devoured the D-Class, leaving the test operator once again empty-handed. Defeated and without any more resources to deal with the beast, the test operator ceased his attempts at besting the creature and followed the Foundation's more cautious approach, expunging any publicly found descriptions of SCP-1128 as needed and diverting any vessels away from the anomaly's exclusion zone, as maintained by the Sea Devils. While the creature had proven treacherous in unexpected situations prior, engulfing the man who first heard the creature's description in a rain puddle, researchers could hardly expect what would transpire. A D-Class, afflicted with the monster's effect and observed for testing, avoided all bodies of water as required. Eventually, however, the D-Class needed to interact with some kind of water, drinking water. In a choice between a little water exposure or certain death, the D-Class felt inclined to choose the former. He filled his cup with water and, for fun, placed his finger into the cup, dropping it into the water. SCP-1128, unseen from the outside, violently pulled the D-Class through the cup into its watery domain. The D-Class had not a chance to scream. This alarmed containment staff, now cognizant that even the tiniest specks of water could transport an afflicted person into SCP-1128's ocean territory. This proved particularly strenuous when a new report of a potential SCP-1128 manifestation arose. An old woman, isolated with her cats and knitting supplies, found an article online with a description of the monster. Frightened and disgusted by what she read, she closed the article and continued on with her monotonous life. Such a life would take a turn for the worse, however, when she too developed that all-encompassing water-based fear. Her apartment overlooked an outdoor pool, and one day, looking outside, she swore she could see that same dark silhouette as the man did, lurking in the water among kids and parents playing. She swiftly closed the window curtains and taped the seams shut, allowing no light to peek through. Eventually, this paranoia affected her hygiene, neglecting showers and baths for fear of the creature's wrath. She swore she could see the silhouette in any individual droplet of water. Her skin began to flake as she avoided water as much as humanly possible, cracks developing on her arms, legs, and face, inflaming into rashes and itches. Her scratching further increased the flaking. She even eliminated water from her diet, sealing the faucets with duct tape and consuming exclusively orange juice. She threw out her cat's water bowls, dehydrating them. They pleaded with her as she continued to devolve, avoiding any contact with the outside world, even as it attempted to contact her. Eventually, a concerned neighbor contacted the local police concerning the situation, and the case caught the Foundation's radar, recognizing the symptoms of a potential SCP-1128 infection. A mobile task force disguised themselves as civilians to enter the apartment building and potentially interfere with the woman's condition. They entered the complex, climbing up the stairs with barraging equipment for forced entry, as would prove necessary to use to enter the woman's apartment. She had nailed the door shut with wood and sealed the cracks along the sides with plaster in an attempt to keep out any water vapor. She had similarly blocked the window with wood planks. A horrid miasma of dead skin and citrus filled the apartment, the old woman soaking it in, ever avoiding the dreaded monster. The Foundation task force attempted peaceful entry, knocking on the door and asking if anyone lived in the apartment. The woman couldn't speak if she wanted to. Her throat had dried to near silence, save a croak. Suddenly, the task force and the woman heard a rumbling noise outside. Thunder, rain. The woman panicked and yelled, "Don't come in here!" in a froggy voice. The task force eventually decided they needed to use their equipment and entered via barrage. The door collapsed and an immediate dense air clogged the task force's sight, blinding and choking them. The woman shrieked and backed against the window inadvertently. The task force insisted they were here to help the woman, but she simply heaved heavily, saying something unintelligible in that dry, cracking voice. The rain began pounding on the window, patter, 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 as the task force attempted to gain hold of the woman. She resisted their movements, moving around the room while the task force intentionally avoided violent confrontation. The rain grew in its intensity as the woman continued running around her apartment, tripping over her starved cats. Eventually, she fell back onto the window, at which the boards blocking it fell onto the floor, exposing the pouring rain fully. She screamed as she saw the silhouette of the monster staring at her in every individual raindrop. One drop landed on her skin, and she violently vanished, pulled into a minuscule speck of water. The task force collapsed from exhaustion, perhaps dreading their inevitable amnestic treatment following exposure with an SCP-1128 afflictee. Yet they couldn't help but wonder what the old woman saw in a single speck of water that could cause that degree of fear and paranoia. The kind of fear only caused by entire oceans condensed into a single droplet. Besides the monster, what else did she see in those multitude of droplets? The fish that populated the sea, the whale carcasses left behind by SCP-1128, the sea devils viewed from below, drifting on the water unsuspecting. Just as one may view a grain of sand and see the Sahara, she too saw that raindrop and viewed an ocean entire, along with whatever malevolent creatures inhabit it. One may have more sympathy for the child, reluctant to jump into the pool water, knowing not necessarily that something inhabits that body of water, but that the body belongs to a cycle much larger than itself, larger than any sea or ocean, and the only thing that can traverse that cycle is a monster, a creature like SCP-1128. The task force went back to their local site to report what happened during the incident. Like so many incidents the Foundation deals with, the sum total of those that risk their lives for the greater good is a couple memory-erasing syringes and another update to documentation. A description of SCP-1128 remains in a stuffy locker, lurking in wait among other horrifying stories in the SCP database's Sea of Terror. Just like that test operator that attempted to best the monster, could the Foundation's attempts ever surmount the possibility of another person being afflicted? Could they conquer the sea? In a member of that task force's dreams, they perceive a dark blue ocean and the distant black shadow that resides within. And from this ocean, they can view the bathtubs, sinks, pools, puddles, cups of water, and rain droplets of the world, seen from below. Although they know not what SCP-1128 looks like, they too experience the fear it summons among those that do, the paranoia, the fear. Although it may not manifest directly in people's lives, it can always be observed, stalking, waiting, lurking under a murky surface, watching with hidden eyes.
It's 3 a.m. and the facility is quiet. Office workers and administrators roam the halls. Security officers stand at their posts, clad in advanced tactical armor and carrying standard-issue M4 carbines. 3 Foundation employees sit at flickering monitors watching a live feed of footage from the containment cell of the infamous SCP-106, or as it's referred to by all staff, the Old Man. No Foundation personnel are permitted to travel within 60 feet of the cell for security reasons, and nobody is permitted to physically interact with the anomaly without the approval of 2/3 of O5 Command. The observer's eyes itch and sting from hours of unending blue light exposure, but they can't look away. The Old Man is crafty. He might have the insatiable bloodlust of a hungry great white shark, but he's not mindless. He's a calculating predator, more sadistic than the worst human serial killer, and he's always searching for the next opportunity. According to the Foundation records, he's been active since at least World War II, and it's estimated that he has hundreds if not thousands of victims to his name, and many of those made simple but extremely foolish mistakes of underestimating him. After all, it only takes a few seconds of inattentiveness and the briefest moment of distraction to give him the window he needs. To do what, you ask? Oh, don't worry, you'll find out, just like they did. The old man has his nickname for a reason. Most of the time, he really does look exactly like that, an old man, or more specifically an old man's decaying corpse, his body covered in rotten, dark, grayish-black flesh that looks like putrid meat. Though the creature has been observed being able to change shape, the rot seems to run too deep for the old man to ever hide it. Foundation employees that have observed SCP-106 for extended periods of time have reported seeing it assume the form of grinning, decayed children and women whose rotted flesh barely hangs on their creaking bones. Just seeing the images through a video feed is enough to cause a lifetime of insomnia and other sleeping issues. Still, they have a job to do and the cameras remain fixed on the old man. He's been completely motionless for 3 months, just sitting there like a Buddhist monk in deep meditation. A novice might see this period of inactivity as a cause for celebration, but those with experience know that this is merely the calm before the storm. SCP-106 can remain in a dormant state for months at a time. Described by the Foundation scientists as a lulling state, it's believed that the old man is simply waiting for its captors to get soft, make a mistake, or simply have a momentary lapse in concentration, which is all it needs to make its move. It had happened so many times before, and it was about to happen again. One of the observers must have felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety as he saw the creature ever so slightly twitch. Just a tiny quiver in the shoulder muscles, but that was enough to tell the observer that their day had just taken a terrifying turn. He grabbed the emergency phone fixed to his desk and practically screamed into the receiver that 106 is moving, that they need a tactical team stat. But it was already too late. He and the other 2 observers stared into the monitors with their mouths agape as a gooey, rust-like substance began to pool around the creature on the floor of its cell. Slowly, the creature craned its withered neck around. Its face was fixed into a broad, yellow-toothed, lipless grin. Its eyes had the kind of dull, flat malice of an underwater predator. It looked directly into the camera, directly at them, and smiled. The observers knew this was bad. Really, really bad. With what they could have sworn was a little nod, the old man began sinking into the rusty puddle it made on the ground beneath it, until it had disappeared entirely. SCP-106 is capable of phasing through any solid surface with ease, making it one of the hardest entities to reliably contain, and earning it a spot on the dreaded Keter class, reserved for the anomalies that are complete nightmares to keep locked up. Through the years of costly research and deadly trial and error, the Foundation would later devise ways of at least slowing the creature down. It's shown to have an aversion to lead, highly complex or random physical structures, and intense bright light. None of these cause harm to the creature, as far as we know, literally nothing can, but they'll at least buy you some precious extra seconds with which to at least try and escape. Seconds the 3 observers didn't have. One of them grabbed an emergency line again and barked into it that they had lost visual on the anomaly. Just then, the observers heard a faint crackling sound behind them and the hissing of a chemical burn. They turned in horror to see a huge rusty burn mark expanding across the wall, right next to the door, which was their only escape route. They backed as far away from the door as they could as a rotten hand began reaching out of the mass of corrosive black sludge, followed by the grinning face of SCP-106, ready to have some fun. Meanwhile, 2 heavily armed security officers, Agents Goodwin and Resnick, came charging down the corridor toward the observation rooms. It became a bleak slogan during SCP-106 escape attempts that all you need to do is follow the screams, and that motto was proven true that night, because awful things were happening to the observation personnel. They were certainly screaming about it. Of course, even with the top-of-the-line firearms, there was little they could do to harm the rampaging old man. He seemed immune to all forms of physical damage. All they could hope to do was keep the thing distracted until the scientists and containment specialists finished the preparations to lure him back into his containment cell. Goodwin surged forward while Resnick covered his 6. Vigilance was key, as unlike a standard human combatant, SCP-106 could attack from literally any angle, including above or below. Physical obstacles were irrelevant to him, and no cover was safe. The hardened security officers could see the burn mark on the wall of the observation room as they approached. SCP-106 was perpetually coated in a thick black mucus with powerful corrosive properties that left any surfaces it touched permanently marred. Foundation scientists speculated that this mucus served as a kind of pre-digestive substance that tenderizes meat and bone alike, but to what purpose this serves is a mystery, as the old man has never been observed eating. It's postulated that the only purpose is causing additional pain. Goodwin and Resnick knew to treat this hissing sludge as a potential threat, as the corrosive properties would remain active for as much as 6 hours before finally fizzling out. The two officers shared a quiet nod before Goodwin breached the observation room door with a hard kick. The two of them surged inside, guns at the ready. In their time working at the Foundation, they'd seen some truly horrific sights. From the mutilation of D-Class personnel, typically death row prison inmates brought in for use as SCP guinea pigs, to the violence and mayhem of a containment breach. But there was nothing in their past that would ever make the horrifying sight they saw in the observation room that night feel normal. All three observers were dead. Almost nothing remained of two of them, and the third, while still intact, no longer looked human. He looked like he'd somehow been dead 100 years in the brief period that the old man had been free. His skin was gray and completely dried out, and his mouth was locked into a perpetual scream. It was a massacre, but there was no sign of the old man. Goodwin grabbed his radio and whispered, "This is Goodwin in Observation Room 6, requesting immediate backup. We have no idea where this thing," but his sentence was cut off by a sudden scream from Agent Resnick. SCP Foundation security officers are as tough as nails, the best of the best, you might say, recruited from the top military organizations in the world. So hearing one of them scream in fright is a rare, if not impossible, occurrence. But even they were forced to yell out in fear when they looked up to see the old man standing on the ceiling, grinning down at them. Resnick raised his M4 and shot a 3-round burst at center mass. SCP-106 didn't care. Even under sustained gunfire from the two security officers, it didn't flinch. The old man simply reached down and snatched Agent Resnick from the ground like it was picking an apple from a tree. The old man held Resnick in one hand and pounded its other rotten fist into the agent's body, breaking all of his bones. Resnick screamed for his partner to help him, but there was no time. Before Goodwin could do anything, SCP-106 began receding back into another slimy burn mark on the wall. Only this time, he was taking his screaming victim with him. Agent Resnick gave one more horrified scream before he was pulled backward into the inky darkness, leaving the room silent except for the burning hiss of the corrosive goo left behind. You might think this would be the end of it, but no. For poor Agent Resnick, the worst was yet to come. He was being dragged into what the SCP Foundation scientists refer to as the Old Man's Pocket Dimension, a miniature layer of reality within our own where the malicious SCP is essentially a cruel, all-powerful god. According to witness reports extracted from victims who were taken to this little nightmare realm, the dimension resembles a series of twisting, endless corridors where the old man stalks and tortures his captured victims to the breaking point, manipulating space and time to his own sadistic ends. On rare occasions, the SCP will even release its victims just for the joy of hunting, capturing, and torturing them all over again. While Agent Resnick was learning the true meaning of terror, containment specialists were mobilizing in its cell, preparing the one known tried and true method of luring the old man back, tempting it with the prospect of causing even more suffering. In order to do this, Foundation personnel take one of the aforementioned Class D personnel and begin inducing extreme pain by breaking a major bone or slicing a tendon every 20 minutes. The victim's agonizing screams are then played over the facility's intercom, acting as bait for the pain-loving old man. The screams echo through the facility's otherwise silent halls as the mutilated corpse of Agent Resnick falls from a new scorch mark on the ceiling. The old man can hear the sounds of suffering ringing out through the air around him, and he can barely contain his excitement over the prospect of a new plaything. The snapped femurs, the torn Achilles tendons, it was all too good to miss. Having had its twisted fun with the security officers and observers, SCP-106 wandered back to its containment cell, where a new screaming victim awaited. The other security officers, containment specialists, and scientists evacuated the area, leaving the old man alone with his prey. While the unfortunate Class D was left to his fate, the rest of the staff commenced cleanup procedures, which mainly involve wiping the brown and black mucus from the walls. It would probably be at least another month before anything like this happened again, and new personnel would be transferred over to the facility to replace the fallen. All in all, just another night at the SCP Foundation.
There's been a strange phenomenon sweeping central Germany. While the true extent of its influence is still unknown, it seems to have been going on for quite some time now, usually in irregular intervals. If you were to head down to any of the towns within the affected region for a visit, the chances of you noticing anything out of the ordinary would still be rather low. But then again, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's entirely possible you could witness an occurrence of SCP-3023, every arachnophobe's worst nightmare. One terrifying incident happened at a baseball game held during the height of the summer. With the scorching sun hanging high above a stadium packed with eager fans, the home team was neck and neck with their longtime rivals from the next town over. As the players took to the field after a changeover, everything hung in the balance. The home team's coach had made a bold change, sending out a new baseman, a young man named Jenik Denke. He was a rookie, untested, but the team's strongest veterans had been doing their best through the whole first half of the game, and still, the scores were almost tied. And so Janik stepped up to the base, unaware that making the next catch would change his life forever. The crowd was silent, the tensions flattening their cheers and chants to a low murmur as the rival's heaviest hitter stepped up to the bat. He was a behemoth, arms twice the size of the baseball bat he carried over his broad shoulder, striding up with confidence as he readied to swing. Watching and waiting, a bead of sweat rolled down Janik's forehead, dropping down the bridge of his nose. He couldn't tell which was making him sweat more, the heat of the sun or his own nerves. His teammate at the pitcher's mound lifted a leg, the baseball in hand. If he gripped the ball any tighter, his fingernails might have splintered and got lodged in the white synthetic leather wrapped around it. Janik stared, not even bothering to wipe away the drops of sweat in his eyes. As his teammate's throwing arm reeled back and hurled the ball forward, it felt like time itself had slowed down. The rival team's batter swatted the baseball out of the air with an earth-shattering crack that sent the ball speeding through the air. Janik dashed to catch it, his mitt outstretched. The ball was careening back down to earth like a white and red meteorite, almost moving fast enough to burn up on re-entry as it hurled through the atmosphere. Janik could feel his heart rattling against his ribcage as every instinct told him he'd never make that fateful catch. In a final act of desperation, he leaped off the ground with every ounce of strength, and all around him the crowd exploded with the thunderous sounds of overjoyed applause. The mighty force of the weighty cork ball was like catching a punch in midair, the tremors of the impact rippling down Janik's arm. He felt that first, before realizing that the ball was now lodged securely in his hand. He'd done it. He'd made the catch. The batter was out. But before he could even react in celebration, it happened. His arm recovered from the initial shock of the catch just in time to feel the lightning-fast flurry of small legs scuttling over his skin. Barely able to catch his breath, the last thing Janik saw was something that used to be the baseball, hurriedly crawling up his chest towards his neck. From a distance, his teammates, the fans in the audience, only saw him drop to the turf, flailing his arms trying to brush off something crawling over him as it attacked and killed the young baseman in what otherwise would have been the proudest moment of his life. While that might have been the first time anything like that had ever happened, it certainly wouldn't be the last. Now, have you ever passed by an abandoned building and felt an urge to look around inside? Of course, a lot of us have. But most of us are smart enough to resist the urge. But on the very rare times you and your friends have worked up the courage to explore somewhere like this, you've probably never found anything all that interesting. Then again, you might want to think twice before sneaking past those keep out and condemned signs. Maxie and Iva learned that lesson the hard way when they gained access to an abandoned office block. Maybe they were trying their hand at making a Blair Witch Project-style amateur found footage movie, or they could have been dabbling in some urban exploration. Best case, there might have been a few places of office furniture left behind by the building's previous occupants, something that the removal company forgot to take when the place was cleared out. The pair of them could have just helped themselves. After all, they needed a new folding chair for their apartment, and there was one just sitting there. Trembling through her stifled tears, Iva's phone was shuddering in her hand. The office had been dark, but she was certain the shadowy shape that had taken Maxie didn't belong to a human being. Clamping her hand over her mouth to silence her terrified breaths, she peered out from under the desk, pointing her phone's camera wherever she looked as it recorded. Iva could hear the loud tapping of several metal legs, moving hurriedly around the empty office. The noise would pause at irregular intervals. Every time it stopped, she thought, prayed that the creature was gone. But just as Iva went to look, she would hear the same sound, quick, scampering steps, the kind of movements that feel unnatural to look at, that are only possible for things with 8 legs. Perhaps that made it worse. The creature didn't shriek or scream or breathe like you'd expect of some awful monster in a horror movie. But then again, how could it? It had been a chair when Maxie had walked up to it, nothing more than an ordinary folding chair. The patter of metal footsteps stopped again, this time for longer. It had to be gone now, she thought. She gave it another few seconds just to make sure the silence wasn't broken again. Crawling out from under the desk, her phone still in her hand, Iva allowed herself to breathe a tentative sigh, only for that sigh to become a scream as it lunged at her, the chair's seat and back now the body and maw of an angry arachnid monster. As Iva screamed, her phone caught the whole gruesome sight on camera. You might be starting to see a pattern emerging here. But there's yet another twist in this multi-legged tale. What if these occurrences weren't just random incidents? Sure, they might fall into the freak of nature category like so many other anomalous incidents, but while it's unclear exactly how these particular anomalies come about, could it be possible that something or someone is creating them on purpose? Mobile Task Force Alpha 21 were already on the scene in the aftermath of the latest incursion. The elite Foundation strike team had eliminated the threat. Luckily, it had started life as a phone, meaning they were able to remotely destroy it, causing its electronic components to detonate. Not before it had killed 2 Foundation personnel, though. Naturally, now came the cleanup operation, gathering up evidence, leaving no trace of what had happened. The SCP Foundation still had little clue as to what exactly caused instances of this nature, a phenomenon they had now designated as SCP-3023. All they had to go on was a handful of cases, and footage recovered from a cell phone that had belonged to an urban explorer who'd met an untimely end at the jaws of a folding chair. But speaking of footage, something unusual had been caught by a security camera a few days before the latest SCP-3023 incident. The security footage showed a man breaking into an office where the latest 3023 instance, the telephone, had been found. As he picked up the phone in question, this individual's jaw appeared to unnaturally split open horizontally, allowing 4 dark, tongue-like appendages to emerge. These appendages rubbed the phone for over half a minute before retracting. The man then returned the phone to its original place and promptly left the office. Thanks to further investigations conducted by the Foundation's forensic experts, this unknown individual was identified as Mr. Sar, the owner of a local restaurant. Naturally, MTF Alpha 21 moved in to apprehend this suspect, the only real lead as to what has been causing the multiple instances of SCP-3023 to begin occurring in Germany. However, when Sar was eventually detained, he showed next to no sign of any anomalies in his body. He claimed to have no memory of the events depicted in the security footage, had never encountered any previous SCP-3023 instance, and seemed to possess no knowledge of the strange properties he exhibited on camera. Nonetheless, the SCP Foundation was forced to detain Mr. Sar, although he never displayed any anomalous behavior ever again. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that, with Sar held in Foundation custody, everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. But sadly for any arachnophobes watching at home, new instances of SCP-3023 kept cropping up, in even stranger and more horrific fashion than ever before. Imagine you had a headache, and we're talking about a real killer here. One of those power drill to the frontal lobe migraines. Maybe you'd spend too much time glued to a computer screen at work, and all that blue light from your monitor scrambled your gray matter. Or perhaps last night was a pretty wild one, and after a few too many drinks, you were left feeling hungover the next morning. What's your go-to response in that situation? Obviously, you can call in sick to work, then go to your medicine cabinet or an over-the-counter pharmacy and grab some basic painkillers, paracetamol, aspirin, ibuprofen, all the things that we trust to make us feel better, not to make things even worse. To Patrick, this started as one of the most normal things in the world. Like you or I, his immediate response to finding himself suffering from a raging headache was to grab a gelatin capsule of ibuprofen. As casually and unsuspectingly as anyone would, he took the pill in hopes of quickly relieving his pain and carrying on with his day, probably even chasing it down with a quick glass of water. Only unbeknownst and unseen to Patrick, something happened the moment that ibuprofen capsule passed through his lips and went towards his throat. Something that stopped it from fully going down his throat, in fact. Much like the baseball, the folding chair, the phone, and who knows how many other unrecorded incidents, the pill had sprouted 8 spider-like legs. At first, it started as a gentle cough, like you'd expect when a capsule gets lodged in your throat. Grabbing a tissue, Patrick gave a few grunting attempts at clearing his airway. There was definitely something in there that almost felt like it was scratching. Not the kind of scratch at the back of the throat brought on by some allergies, the kind of scratching that caused Patrick to cough up blood when he put a tissue to his mouth, the kind of scratching that he could feel moving, crawling around his windpipe. Perhaps if he had more time, Patrick could have raced to the hospital and had whatever was clawing its way around his throat removed safely with that free European healthcare. Unfortunately, the thing that the capsule had turned into just as he swallowed it wasn't that kind. Racked with unimaginable pain, Patrick was writhing and spluttering uncontrollably, his mouth filled with more bile and blood than saliva at that point. The scratching was moving, and not down towards his esophagus towards his stomach. It was going outwards, burrowing through the insides of his neck until it reached his spinal cord. By that time, the little ibuprofen capsule-sized instance of SCP-3023 came crawling out from the back of his neck. Patrick was already dead. Let's say you were aware of this, of all these strange happenings, seemingly ordinary everyday objects turning into angry, aggressive spiders. Obviously, the Foundation might want to have a little chat with you about how you came across such information, but for the sake of argument, imagine you did know. You might think the smart idea would be to leave. After all, SCP-3023 instances are only known to occur in a specific region of central Germany, neatly situated in the middle of Leipzig and Dusseldorf. So you might think that it's time to up sticks and leave that area. Maybe even leave Germany altogether. Just hop in your car and drive to safety. If only it were that easy. A family of 4 was cruising down the Autobahn in an SUV. Just another car on the packed highway. Exhausted after hours on the road, Matteo and Nina sat quietly up front, making sure they didn't wake their son and daughter, both asleep in the rear passenger seats. The car was picking up speed, about to pass 70 miles per hour as it gradually carried them home, although it wasn't going to get them all the way back. The screech of twisting metal woke both sleeping kids up screaming, their parents equally shocked at the sudden noise. The car lurched and buckled, like something had collided with it. But this was no ordinary traffic accident. Without any rhyme or reason, the front of their SUV warped itself into the distinctive shape of a cephalothorax, while the rear turned into what looked like an abdomen. As the car shifted and reshaped around them, the grinding of metal as auto parts became huge metal legs. Matteo, Nina, and their children were still trapped inside, never to make it out. But the creepy crawly carnage wasn't just contained inside the car. The newly born arachnid abomination hurtled its way down the Autobahn, managing to maintain its speed. Other drivers swerved and slammed on their brakes to avoid hitting the creature they couldn't even believe was scuttling hurriedly along the highway. Unfortunately, this led them to careening into other cars, smashing headfirst into a pileup that claimed the lives of 41 people. Not that the SCP Foundation would ever admit it. With one of their facilities only 250 meters away, they were quick to dispatch an airstrike to deal with the spidery SUV once it became clear that Mobile Task Force Alpha 21 couldn't contain it. Across the board, anything capable of sprouting 4 pairs of spindly legs and crawling towards you with the intent to kill tends to rack up quite the body count. But dealing with bodies are some people's business. That was the case for Lucas, a newly qualified coroner. After passing years of training, he was working with the local police department, performing autopsies and examining bodies to help them with their investigations. Sure, it may not have been the most glamorous profession, but Lucas could sleep soundly, knowing that he'd never get hurt by a dead body. A John Doe, a body that hadn't yet been identified, had just been brought in after police had found him on the side of the road. Lucas thoroughly washed his hands, put on his gloves and scrubs, along with the rest of the autopsy team. He'd sat in on at least a dozen of these procedures, studied the relevant process and techniques. Everything had prepared him for the job of figuring out how someone had died. But not even the most experienced medical examiner could be prepared for what happened next. Taking the lead, Lucas began by making the primary incision into the cadaver's chest. It always reminded him of a particular scene in The Thing, where a character's stomach opened up and became a maw of frightening teeth, revealing them to be the titular shape-shifting alien. That thought was quickly shaken away when suddenly, to Lucas's surprise, the body lurched violently on the examining table. Not everyone expects dead bodies to be able to move, and while it might be rare, it's also not impossible. Any number of things can cause someone's remains to move after death. Muscles atrophying or spasming, the body filling up with gas as it breaks down, Of course, any coroner would expect these movements to have subsided by the time someone reaches the autopsy room. Caught off guard by the sudden violent movement, Lucas stepped away, dropping his scalpel. His panting breath warmed his face beneath his surgical mask as he stared for a moment, waiting to see if the body moved again. Certain it would be still now, Lucas wrote the spooky incident off just as a muscle spasm and leaned over to retrieve his scalpel. But while he was crouching, he noticed something strange. It almost looked as if there were a pair of protrusions poking out from under the dead man's skin. Walking around the other side of the table, Lucas found 2 more similar lumps at the body's abdomen, almost as if something was inside, ready to force its way out. Without warning, the John Doe suddenly moved again on the examining table, only this time, it didn't stop. Lucas couldn't believe his eyes. The man's face was still, frozen in the same dead expression, but his arms and legs were thrashing and writhing around as if he was somehow still alive. 4 extra limbs suddenly burst from the sides of the cadaver, and the now 8-legged creature reared itself up, leaping towards a member of the autopsy team. It scuttled and skittered around on its new appendages while Lucas watched in horror. Blood-curdling screams filled the autopsy room as he bolted for the door. Lucas raced down the corridor. The coroner dared not looking behind him while sprinting through the city mortuary. Behind him, he could hear the thudding of the spider's multiple limbs right at his heels. Out of the corner of his eyes, right on the edge of his peripheral vision, he could see the massive legs scuttling towards him. Maybe he would get out, run all the way to safety before the spider was upon him. But how can you hope to outrun something with 8 legs when you only have 2? The most important thing to remember is that while any unsuspecting inanimate object near you might suddenly decide to become an angry spider, the chances of it happening are very, very low. But especially if you happen to be in central Germany, those chances are never 0 either. The creature let out an unmistakable squeal of rage as stimulus Y835 took effect. Dr. Christensen pressed his face up against the glass, eager to see the results. It had to work this time. It simply had to. He was certain that this attempt would make all the other failures worth it, and he'd once again prove the Foundation's faith in him to be well placed. SCP-5683 shrieked a loud, insect-like sound that would have normally made the blood run cold of anyone that heard it. But to Dr. Christensen, it was like music, a monster's dying fanfare to mark his success. Soon he'd be the researcher who neutralized not 1, but 2 tenacious, highly adaptable anomalies. The senior researcher could feel his heart racing as the deadly giant spider started to twitch, then burst into 2 identical entities. The pair of arachnid anomalies had reacted much like the results of the tissue sample tests conducted earlier, dividing into 2 separate organisms. Christensen held his breath. The tissue samples had destroyed each other, attacking and injecting the other with lethal doses of venom. Surely, he reasoned, duplicating SCP-5683 into 2 would have the same result. His heart sank as he watched one of the spider creatures, the duplicate, perish almost immediately. As it often did when presented with human prey, SCP-5683 attacked using its mandibles and impaled its copy with its front legs to pin it in place. The clone had bitten back, with Dr. Christensen already knowing that would have granted SCP-5683 an immunity to its own venom. Its powers of adaptation were fiercely, frustratingly efficient, and nothing demonstrated this more than the intense reaction from the man tasked with destroying it. Dr. Christensen hurled the nearest object, a coffee mug, at a glass window of the observation room, overlooking the test chamber. He pounded his fist against the glass, hardly with the required force to cause damage, but enough to send pain shooting down Christensen's wrist, which then nestled in his forearm, a reminder that the experiment, like the others, had failed. "Why can't I destroy you?" he muttered through clenched teeth, looking with hatred at the enormous spider in the chamber below. The directive had reached him the day immediately after New Year's Day 2020, and straight from a member of the O5 Council no less. Their message expressed how impressed the Council was with Dr. Christensen's success with the Doomsday Clock project, and how favorably his name had been mentioned in Council meetings. This boded well for the ambitious Foundation doctor. He'd been hoping to snag the director position at Site-04 now that Director Bray had retired. But there was one more test from the O5 Council. They wanted Dr. Christensen to use the knowledge garnered during his previous success to solve the SCP-5683 problem. If he could successfully complete that assignment, it would be his ticket to being promoted. With the comfy role of site director and all its perks in mind, Dr. Christensen accepted the assignment from the Council to deal with SCP-5683. SCP-5683 was quite the beast, not an anomaly for those with intense arachnophobia. The huge spider-like organism was extremely hostile towards humans and had to be kept in a constant state of medical sedation. Otherwise, it would relentlessly attempt to breach containment and slaughter any and all personnel in its path. What had made SCP-5683 such a problem for the Foundation was the creature's ability to rapidly regenerate damage, as well as modify its own body in reaction to threats. Much like a certain particularly hard-to-destroy reptile, the spider-like entity could adapt itself to become more resistant to any danger posed to it. And of course, this meant that the Foundation needed this dangerous creature eradicated. The frequent containment breaches and sheer number of casualties caused by the arachnid anomaly were significant enough to cause an increasing drain on the SCP Foundation's resources. So, with the termination order coming from the very top, the O5 Council themselves, Dr. Christensen was tasked with overseeing the neutralization of SCP-5683. During an initial deliberation, Dr. Christensen met with researcher Miles and Hall, junior researcher Silva, and security chief Ade to discuss earlier attempts to terminate SCP-5683. The new head of the termination project was perturbed to learn that the research team had little in the way of useful information to offer, beyond what the Foundation already knew about the creature. But Christensen decided some basic stress testing would at least be a start. After a successful tissue sample test, wherein some of SCP-5683's genetic material was incinerated, Dr. Christensen tried to simply destroy the spider with fire. An understandable response, to say the least. However, exposing SCP-5683 to temperatures of 850 degrees Celsius for just 30 seconds didn't quite yield the easy victory he had hoped for. The arachnid thrashed about and screeched in reaction to the heat, only to rapidly develop a form of armor plating covering its entire body. The armor was comprised of an unknown, unidentifiable substance, but it was enough to prevent SCP-5683 from combusting. Reconvening with the rest of the team, Dr. Christensen hid his pride, assuring everyone he was just trying to establish a baseline during the previous test. Of course, he hadn't believed that terminating SCP-5683 with fire would be a success, or so he claimed, hiding how much he'd longed for an easy solution so he could snatch up the vacant Site-04 director position. But to ensure the others, Christensen explained that he'd requisitioned some anomalous materials from the O5 Council that they'd be using in their next termination attempts. Nothing that was anomalous enough to require containment, but toxic enough that they presented a few options for destroying SCP-5683. Just for logging purposes, sir, may I inquire about the specific substances we're shipping in? Junior researcher Sylvia had asked. Of course, Y220, Y835, and Y43. Dr. Christensen quickly recounted them all from memory. I'm told they should be arriving within the week. I expect each would be enough to do the job, but it's best to hedge our bets. This spider doesn't compare to the lizard, I'll tell you that. Junior researcher Silva seemed to take an interest in what Dr. Christensen had just alluded to, his previous work with the lizard. He probed further about it, and Christensen gave a solemn response. The aspiring Foundation doctor recalled an incident from a few years earlier during his experimentation with SCP-682. Some of the methods Dr. Christensen had opted to employ in an attempt to destroy the hard-to-destroy reptile had led to a severe containment breach. When describing it, he used the word unpleasant, perhaps out of guilt at how many personnel had lost their lives due to his actions. Brushing the topic aside, he assured the team to get on with testing the new anomalous stimuli on SCP-5683. Stimulus Y220 initially showed some promise. During a tissue sample test, it successfully converted part of SCP-5683 into glass, which then violently exploded, leaving nothing behind. But attempts to use it to neutralize the creature itself quickly quashed those promising results. Within 9 seconds of being exposed to stimulus Y220, SCP-5683's body rapidly turned to glass. Around 80% of its arachnid mass proceeded to explode, shattering in all directions, sending clear shards showering over the testing chamber. As he watched, Dr. Christensen allowed himself to believe that this was mission accomplished, that he'd successfully terminated SCP-5683. But his celebration was premature. The spider quickly began reconstituting itself, its body regenerating within the space of 30 seconds. After testing with both stimuli Y220 and Y835, Dr. Christensen's frustration seemed to be increasing with each failed attempt. He knew his promotion was within reach, and as far as he could remember, he'd done good work with damaging SCP-682. Why should eradicating this anomalous spider be any different? However, it was a test with stimulus Y436 that enraged the ambitious doctor. Expecting the anomalous stimulant to turn SCP-5683 into a fine mist, Christensen watched as the creature's body vanished, literally vaporizing, changing states of matter to little more than water in the air. Suddenly, every light in the facility powered off, plunging the testing chamber into darkness. When the lights came back on, SCP-5683 was standing on all 8 legs, right where it had been missed only 3 seconds earlier. The research team had gathered for another mediation, and Dr. Christensen's anger still hadn't subsided. He kicked a chair to emphasize his frustration, alarming junior researcher Silva, who urged him to calm down. After eventually cooling his temper, Christensen made an announcement that caused even greater concern to spread amongst the team. "I'm requisitioning Y910. Researcher Halls and Researcher Miles objected, trying to get Dr. Christensen to realize that the course of this action was excessive, overkill even. But Christensen disregarded them, standing by his latest method for terminating SCP-5683. The Global Occult Coalition had previously used Y910 to poison gods. He felt sure that it would work on one anomalous giant spider. His time was running short. Dr. Christensen was aware that any day now, the O5 Council would be appointing a replacement director of Site-04, and he wanted that promotion. And he didn't seem to care what corners he cut and what risks he took to get there, even if it meant endangering his research personnel. Dr. Christensen declared that in order to save time, he would be bypassing tissue samples to test for termination attempts. The longer it took to terminate the anomalous arachnid, the more his window of opportunity closed, and the further the director position slipped from his fingertips. Accepting full responsibility for the reckless decision and anything that might go wrong, Dr. Christensen wanted to use stimulus Y910 directly on SCP-5683. He urged the research team to make the necessary preparations, unaware of what his decision would lead to, and the chaos it had already caused. The test was catastrophic, so much so that it caused a containment breach. With SCP-5683 loose and scuttling about the facility on its multiple legs, Dr. Christensen and junior researcher Silva were forced to rush to the secure bunker on site for safety. Christensen was in a state of panic until he noticed something, and not for the first time either. He'd been detecting a foul smell whenever he'd conducted the meetings to discuss termination options. But the other members of the research team had quickly explained it was nothing more than repeated accidents in the cafeteria. But here was the stench again, worse than ever. Yet junior researcher Silva brushed it off again, stating that SCP-5683 must have gotten into the facility's reactor. The junior researcher quickly became inconsolable, stating that the whole situation was his fault. Dr. Christensen interjected, demanding to know how it was and what Silva had done to cause this situation. He replied that it was his duty to oppose ill-advised actions, and when Christensen had declared his intention to use Y910, the junior researcher hadn't opposed him. Shifting the blame from himself onto his subordinate, Dr. Christensen chastised Silva over how many personnel had died because of the junior researcher's refusal to do his job, ignoring that it was Christensen's own ambitions that had led to the current chaos. Refusing to be made a scapegoat, Dr. Christensen vowed to pin the full culpability for SCP-5683's containment breach onto junior researcher Silva, saying he'd tell the O5 Council the so-called truth about what had happened. but Silva pointed out that there wasn't much of a likelihood that the bunker would survive the reactor overloading. He urged the ambitious Foundation doctor to admit some responsibility of his own for what had happened, but Christensen refused. Suddenly, there came a thunderous banging at the bunker door. A debilitating pang of fear struck Dr. Christensen, causing him to scream and retreat from the entrance, yelling "no" and "please," as if he was pleading with the universe itself to spare him from the spider. Junior Researcher Silva walked over to the bunker door just as strong arachnid legs tore the heavy steel bulkhead off its hinges like it was made of little more than wet paper. There was SCP-5683, the enormous spider skittering into the bunker, screeching all the while. Silva had put himself between SCP-5683 and the ambitious Foundation doctor, whose hunger for a promotion had led to all this carnage. The junior researcher announced his noble intention to sacrifice himself, occupying the creature while urging Christensen to run. The doctor shoved Silva towards the spider and prepared to run, then all of a sudden, SCP-5683 vanished. Junior Researcher Silva told Dr. Christensen he was disappointed, before Researcher Miles, Researcher Hall, and Security Chief Ade all entered the bunker through the torn open hole where the door had been. Christensen questioned where SCP-5683 had gone, to which Silva explained there was little reason to keep a dummy around once it had served its purpose as a substitute. "You mentioned you worked with the lizards, sir," the junior researcher recounted, "that there was a containment breach. If you don't terribly mind me asking, how did you escape that situation? It seemed quite lethal, didn't it?" Afraid and confused, Dr. Christensen asked where he was. Hall and Miles urged him not to ask questions he already knew the answer to. Silva explained who they all were, a jury, specifically Dr. Christensen's jury, and according to them, the ambitious doctor had disgraced himself again. Christensen had been there for a long time, a considerably long time, reliving the same events over and over again, with SCP-5683 acting as a substitute for SCP-682. It was the same situation, he'd made the same decisions, the same mistakes, and it had cost lives. Now Dr. Christensen was trapped in an endless loop, penance for the casualties that had occurred at his hands, all in the pursuit of his own selfish personal gain. He asked the jury how long he'd be stuck there, a question Silva responded to with, "Until you take responsibility, sir." Immediately, Dr. Christensen tried to admit that this all had been his fault, but he didn't mean it. Not really. He hadn't accepted blame. He just wanted a quick and easy way out of the loop, and the jury of his deceased personnel knew it. Christensen ran for the door in the hopes of escaping his fate. Futile as his chances were, a black iron chain appeared from around the corner and wrapped itself around the overambitious doctor's throat. Ignorant of his pleas for forgiveness, saying he was sorry wouldn't bring back the people who died in service of his aspirations to becoming a site director. The chain dragged Dr. Christensen through the facility at such a speed that he collided with every wall and every corner as he turned sharply, being pulled along the floor. But that and the walls quickly crumbled away, revealing a sight that made Dr. Christensen start screaming that it wasn't his fault, and he never really stopped. What followed involved a great deal of blood and fire. Once it was over, it left behind the same awful stench the doctor had smelt before, and he'd soon be smelling it again too, as the cycle repeated itself. The directive had come straight from a member of the O5 Council. They were impressed with Dr. Christensen, and the ambitious Foundation doctor had been hoping to snag a director position at Site-04. But there was one final test for Dr. Christensen to solve the SCP-5683 problem. We've all heard of the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, a title that invokes the image of a stairway leading up to a land of peace and paradise. But where else could a stairway lead? To a dusty attic full of old photo albums? To the upper level of a mall where the movie theater and frozen yogurt shop are neatly situated? Perhaps it leads to a rooftop with a beautiful view. Or maybe, just maybe, a staircase could lead you to SCP-2427. SCP-2427, appropriately nicknamed A Thing Full of Stuff, is an extra-dimensional area filled with a variety of unusual and anomalous objects. SCP-2427 can be accessed by way of a broken stone staircase located in rural Ohio. According to local legend, carrying a sprig of hemlock up the broken stairs will allow a person to emerge into a mysterious grass clearing that appears to be in a forest somewhere in the United States. No matter what time a person ascends the staircase, the solar time in the clearing will always be 2 p.m. You know how people say it's 5 o'clock somewhere? Well, it's 2 o'clock somewhere too, and that somewhere is here. The pocket dimension that is SCP-2427 is thought to have been a holding area for weapons, prisoners, and artifacts belonging to an ancient cult known as the Brazen Heart. Little is known about this relatively obscure cult, other than the fact that they worship the demonic entity Moloch, a known enthusiast of violent human sacrifice, and were previously thought to have been eradicated during the Spanish Inquisition. The existence of SCP-2427 suggests that they are very much not eradicated, and are still active. They refer to these holding areas as attics, and though no confirmed members of the Brazen Heart have been contacted, it is considered possible that there are at least a handful of other attics hidden around the world. The Foundation has identified 7 anomalous objects inside of SCP-2427 so far, each strange in its own beautiful, though often terrible way. Like snowflakes, if they were capable of killing or maiming you. The first object in SCP-2427, aka SCP-2427-1, is a seemingly normal fire hydrant. However, if you think there's anything normal about the items found here, then you haven't been paying attention. The hydrant is made out of lead, and when opened, it expels high levels of ionized radiation. No specific measurements of the radiation have been taken yet, but it is definitely hazardous to human health. One unfortunate member of D-Class personnel has proven that it is a high enough level to melt human flesh. Sorry about your face, Dave. The hydrant is currently contained within an electrified perimeter and is not to be opened under any circumstances to prevent any further flesh melting. The last thing we need is another Dave incident. The second object contained within SCP-2427 or SCP-2427-2 is not actually an object at all. It's a building. Only on number 2 and we're already throwing curveballs at you. Trust no one. Surprises lurk around every corner. This particular building resembles a large multi-storied sanitarium built in the 1860s. Though it is clear from the outside that the building has or should have multiple stories, the inside is a different matter. Past the building's front doors is a non-Euclidean space consisting of a single floor and 3 sparsely decorated rooms with one central foyer. The first room is the holding place for SCP-2427-3. The second contains SCP-2427-4, and the third room contains nothing except scattered religious documents, bottled water, and a selection of canned food. No unauthorized staff are permitted to enter the building, in order to minimize complications or potential employee casualties. The first 2 anomalies on this list are hardly even strange by SCP Foundation's standards. Sure, the hydrant can melt your face, and the building defies the laws of physics and space. But that's just a regular Tuesday around these parts. Been there, seen that. What else you got? Well, SCP-2427-3 is where things really get strange. If you're wandering through the bowels of SCP-2427-2 and you make a wrong turn into the first room, you will find yourself face to face with a startling sight. This entity is a combination of electronic circuitry, a cow's digestive tract, the hairless head of a human man, a hat rack, several lengths of garden hose, and an unidentified crystalline structure. This creature is extraordinarily fast and strong, exhibiting carnivorous tendencies and a very strong point of view on the world around it. Lucky for us, it is capable of speech and is able to tell us just what it thinks. Though this monstrosity doesn't have much of a right to pass judgment on anyone, cow intestine body and all, it has expressed a violent hatred of all life that it considers impure. Anyone who encounters SCP-2427-3 experiences an overwhelming desire to submit themselves for judgment, allowing the creature to determine their purity. There is a rumor that if one is judged to be pure, they will have a wish granted. If they are deemed impure, however, they will be devoured alive. If you're tempted to introduce yourself to the creature, your odds are not especially great. The creature has not encountered a single pure being yet. In order to protect the Foundation staff working in its vicinity, the entrance to SCP-2427-3's room has been sealed off with a reinforced steel door, and the windows have been paved over with concrete. Armed guards are watching the entrance at all times. The creature must be fed 1 live goat per day in order to keep its appetite satiated. The Foundation's goat budget is through the roof these days, but it's worth it to keep the thing contained. Better to spend money on goats now and not spend money on cannibalized personnel later. SCP-2427-4 consists not of an object located within a room, but the room itself. The room, which contains no furniture and a linoleum floor, has a peculiar effect on the human psyche. Once a person steps foot into the room, they lose consciousness for 5 minutes. During this time, they will speak freely, listing off a variety of negative qualities about themselves. Once they wake up, they have no memory of entering this state or anything that they said during it. It's cheaper than therapy, right? But it's also much weirder and less effective, so you get what you pay for in the end. A member of D-Class personnel who was observed inside of the room waxed poetic about his personal failings, beginning his monologue with, "My soul is a den of spiders," and ending it with, "Oh, here, whence I awaken, hesitate not to feed my flesh and my soul to the judge beast." Somebody give this guy a hug, because the room seems to have no adverse effects on human test subjects except for causing everyone who hears their monologue a bit of discomfort. There are no containment procedures in effect for it at this time. We've had rooms, fire hydrants, and horrible meat robot hybrids, and now you can't even trust the clouds in the sky. SCP-2427-5 is a seemingly innocent cloud, hovering stationary over the building. When looked at by a human for more than 3 seconds, the cloud will eject a ball of solid lead towards the person at a supersonic speed. That's right, folks. This cloud can and will shoot you. It hates being observed, but it also hates when you try to leave the perimeter. It will attack any person attempting to leave by firing the same lead ball at them. So far, 14 personnel have been killed by this highly aggressive cloud. And some people still think thunderstorms and hail are the worst things clouds have to offer. So naive. As it is a literal cloud, there is no way to contain it, so no people in the vicinity of the cloud are permitted to look at it for more than 3 seconds at a time. SCP-2427-6 is a series of 18 small trees, spread throughout the instance of SCP-2427. Above ground, the trees look normal, though their species has proven surprisingly difficult to determine. From an external perspective, they are simply ordinary trees. However, radar analysis revealed that the roots of these trees are deeply strange. Instead of the usual twisting tree roots, the ground below these trees contains a mass in the shape of a human body. Much to the disgust of the observing researchers, these humanoid masses occasionally twitch and move, as if alive. The trees themselves appear to be growing from the crotch area of each humanoid figure. How's that for Morningwood? I know, I get it, bad joke. This arrangement between tree and person seems to be some kind of punishment, as each tree is marked with a plaque reading, "The lecherous suffer what they must, and it is beautiful." Until it can be certain that the condition of these human roots is not contagious, these trees are to be treated as potential biohazards and isolated in individual containers. The final object in SCP-2427 currently categorized by the Foundation is SCP-2427-7. SCP-2427-7 is a pile of ashes and wood located just behind a posted sign that reads, "The Liar's Cradle." Extensive testing has been established that the Liar's Cradle was almost certainly used as a torture device in interrogations performed by the Brazen Heart. A person standing within the boundaries of the cradle, which encompasses the aforementioned circle of wood and ashes, is unable to lie without suffering the consequences. Namely, they will be set on fire. The nature of how exactly the Liar's Cradle works is not certain, and more research needs to be done on it. However, this much is known for sure. It contains no sentient intelligence. It is not aware of what it is doing. It does not kill its victims, rather it keeps them miraculously alive as it sets them on fire, prolonging their agony and allowing their interrogators to get the truth out of them. A series of experiments revealed that it only immolates a person who is knowingly lying. D-Class personnel give demonstrably false information to repeat in the cradle without knowledge of its falsehood were not set on fire. However, when those same D-Class personnel knowingly lied in the boundaries, they immediately were set ablaze. It is almost certain that the Brazen Heart cult used the cradle as a method of interrogating presumed liars in their midst. Further investigation will likely reveal human remains beneath the cradle itself, though this is just a hypothesis currently. But come on, there has to be some bones somewhere beneath something as ominous as the liar's cradle. Though they have only identified 7 anomalies inside SCP-2427 at the moment, there are plenty more lurking in there, waiting to be discovered. In the foyer of SCP-2427-2, the Foundation discovered an extremely ominous list of items, clearly belonging to members of the cult of the Brazen Heart. This list included some familiar items, such as pilgrim provisions, also known as the canned beans and soup found in SCP-2427-2, a Level 3 Purity Proctor, a purge engine disguised as a fire hydrant, and the Liar's Cradle. However, it also contained many things that have not yet been discovered, such as 1 slaughtering perseverance, 27 pyre children, 3 ascended cultivars, 7 supreme angelics, 9 dragons, and the Brazen Heart itself. Dr. Gordon McElroy, Site Director of Area 2427, put out a memo to all Level 4 and higher staff assigned to the area after the discovery of this list. Understandably, he was most concerned about the supreme angelics and the dragons, particularly the latter. The cult, as most cults are, is fond of deliberately obscure language, but you don't want to rule out the possibility they've got a fire-breathing lizard or 2 stashed away. In the meantime, as the Foundation is working to better understand the contents of SCP-2427, the area has been sealed off to the public. A 500-meter perimeter has been established around its entrance, and a fake private country club has been set up as a front. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the anomalies on the list are discovered, and this thing full of stuff gets even fuller of even more stuff. Let's just hope none of it ever gets out, because if there are more of these addicts out there, who knows what else the Brazen Heart is hiding? Their little cult may not be as extinct as we thought. Spiders. Spiders everywhere, covering every inch of the containment site, entombing screaming researchers in webs and crawling all over them. How did this happen? Let's rewind. We regret to inform you the break room is closed today. There is currently a spider loose in the facility. Researcher Yuri craned his neck to look past the line of personnel that had gathered in the hallway, reading the sign hastily scrawled on a piece of paper from the photocopier. Behind him, he overheard a fellow researcher, Holland, complaining about the wait to get to the break room. Not in the least part pleased about the idea of spending his precious half-hour lunch break standing around in a corridor, while someone presumably stood on a table with a can of Onslaught insecticide. When Yuri instinctively corrected him that spiders were arachnids, not insects, Holland shot him a venomous glare, indicating that he already knew that. As he turned away from the awkward encounter, he noticed researcher Andrews next to him, who wasn't grumbling away to his coworkers or impatiently checking his watch like everyone else. He was staring at the ceiling. Yuri started looking up in the same direction, following Andrew's gaze until he noticed what had him so transfixed. Above the heads of the gaggle of personnel waiting to access the break room was a mass of cobwebs. Ordinarily, there would be no cause for concern. After all, even the Foundation's facilities needed regular cleaning and upkeep. But what was odd about this web was, at first glance, it looked like there was a piece of equipment trapped in it. Some kind of machine component. It was only when Yuri squinted and leaned forward to see closer that he noticed the component wasn't in the web. It was made of the web. The very same thin, wispy thread that had been wound in such a way that it was forming part of something. As for exactly what, it was hard to say. But it immediately had Yuri thinking a particularly unnerving thought. A spider was loose in the facility. The The sign did not specify what kind of spider, and the odd web above seemed to indicate that it might well have been of the anomalous variety. Leaving the complaining personnel to stand around wasting their breaks, Yuri ducked down an adjacent hallway and started scrolling through the contacts on his phone. He read a file on an anomaly that caused ordinary everyday objects to suddenly transform into angry spiders, and a close respected colleague of his, Agent McGuire, worked closely with the mobile task force responsible for containing these agitated arachnids. Hearing McGuire answer the phone, Yuri immediately asked him about the current state of SCP-3023. McGuire very passively told him that everything was normal, and that no new instances had been reported in the region. SCP-3023 seemed to only affect a very specific area of central Germany, right in the middle of Hanover, Leipzig, and Kassel. Then, Yuri asked if it was possible for an inanimate object to suddenly turn into an angry spider anywhere outside of that area. For example, in the break room. Immediately, his brain conjured up the image of the billiards table with 8 spindly spider legs erupting out from beneath its green surface, angrily crawling all around the room, waiting for the break room door to open and all the impatient personnel to come flooding in. McGuire told him what SCP-3023 instances did to any living thing they came into contact with, and it sure wasn't pretty. From the other side of the line, Agent McGuire reassured researcher Yuri that there had never been any reported instances involving SCP-3023 outside of Germany. When Yuri followed that up with the question of whether or not there were any currently in containment, the MTF Alpha 21 operative replied that all instances were normally destroyed on contact. The answers put the panicked researcher at ease, long enough for him to calmly apologize to his friend and thank him for his time before hanging up the phone. That was when the lights went out. An alarm started to sound, bellowing from deep in the heart of the facility and reaching outwards, like the strands of a web. The sound denoted one horrible thing. There had been a containment breach. As the blood-red emergency lighting blinked on, Yuri rushed back the way he'd come, expecting to see the same huddle of personnel near the break room, expecting one of them might know exactly which SCP had made it out of containment. The sight waiting for him was far worse. As he approached the hallway, he heard the overlapping screams of his colleagues. Researcher Andrew came dashing around the corner, his wiry frame sending him barreling past Yuri before he could even ask what was going on. Then, from around the corner, Researcher Holland could be seen clawing his way along the floor, yelling for someone to help him. There were spiders all over him. Thousands of them. The sheer number of them crawling over his body made them look almost like a formless mass that was slowly pulling him back down the corridor towards the break room. Yuri dashed forwards, intending to grab Holland's hand and pull him to safety. But before he could get close enough, the other researcher had been taken by the spiders. That was when Yuri turned the corner and saw the full extent of the containment breach. Spiders everywhere. Crawling all over the floor, spiders. Climbing up the walls, spiders. Dangling from the ceiling by threads, spiders. A number of lumps on the ground were writhing and thrashing, but so covered in spiders that it took Yuri a second to realize who was underneath. The other personnel, each of them trying to brush away the spiders that were coating their bodies and dragging them off to who knows where. Under the blinking red of the emergency light, the spiders made the hallway look like it was alive, and illuminated what was crawling at the far side, directly opposite Yuri. The giant spider was looking right at him, each one of its numerous dark eyes looking practically demonic under the red light. It was enormous, easily at least 9 feet tall, big enough to almost fill the corridor. Keeping his eyes fixed on it out of fear, Yuri felt a slow, shaking step backwards, trying to move his legs behind him as gently as possible. If he turned to run, he'd startle the horrifying creature and probably bring it racing after him on its multiple legs. Before he could get away, he would be dragged away with the others, or worse. From the other side of the corridor, the spider's front pinchers bristled as Yuri shifted his weight onto his back foot. He hated looking at the monstrous arachnid, but forced himself to keep his eyes front, looking right at it as it looked back at him. Rear foot planted, he began to lift his other one, only to see the spider's front 2 legs extend outwards. It was reaching towards him, through the writhing mass of smaller spiders that coated the walls and floor between them. Yuri's single ice-cold bead of sweat ran down the back of his neck, under the collar of his shirt, and crawled down his back. it was impossible not to imagine it was one of the spiders. The two giant legs became four as the spider seemed to extend from its space it occupied at the other side of the corridor. Was it just stretching, repositioning, or getting ready to dash forward? Every second of uncertainty made researcher Yuri all the more terrified, noticing out of the corner of his eyes the mass of smaller spiders inching closer to him. It was like the giant was the general of an entire 8-legged horde that was making a skittering advance towards their target. The side of the hallway Yuri found himself frozen in was a corner, turning down in only one direction, only one way he could run, and one path that the spiders could follow him down. It was either move now or wait for the spiders to move first and faster. He turned heel and ran, the soles of his shoes squeaking against the floor. Behind him came the rapid thudding of 8 heavy legs hurriedly scuttling through the corridor after him. The sound began lower, on the floor, then sideways, scaling up the wall until it was above, drumming along the ceiling as Yuri forced himself not to look over his shoulder. He already knew what he would see, and the thought of it horrified him. The huge spider chasing after him from above. Pincers reared as it readied itself to lunge the moment it was close enough to catch him. Hours later, 2 agents, Jetter and Moore, were part of the cleanup crew tasked with sweeping each floor of the facility. Orange tongues of flame spat from their incinerators, clearing masses of spiders until there was no trace. Even without the hundreds of thousands of spiders crawling all over it, the facility was in dire need of repair, with chunks missing from the walls and damage all over the place. So much metal and plastic was missing. It was almost like it had just been ripped from every conceivable place, but with no debris strewn everywhere. Part of the building had just vanished. Maybe these spiders just ate all the metal and plastic they found, Moore joked. Flamethrowers at the ready, they managed to push the spiders back to their nest, expecting to find a room covered in cobwebs, possibly even with some lifeless humanoid shapes entangled in a big web. What they weren't expecting to come across was a room full of 3D printers. But then again, that was to be expected when it came to SCP-4663, otherwise known as SCP-4663. 3D printed spiders, printing printed printers, printing spider printers, printing spiders, printing printed spider printers, printing spider printers, printing spiders, printing printed printer spiders, printing spidered spider printers, printing spider printed printer printers. Long tongue-tying names aside, SCP-4663 had long been examined by the researchers of the SCP Foundation. The designation itself was given to an anomalous species of spiders that had been discovered to be indigenous to areas of Europe and certain regions within North and South America. Far from being potentially venomous or capable of transforming seemingly inanimate everyday objects into more spiders, this particular species instead displayed a natural aptitude for, well, 3-dimensional filament printing. These SCP-4663 spiders are capable of consuming anything in their path, as long as it is inorganic matter, meaning unlike non-anomalous species of spider, they don't actually feed on insects or even mammals. Instead, instances of SCP-4663 usually subsist on a diet of primarily metal and plastic. However, they don't appear to consume these for any kind of nutritional value. Through some anomalous process in their physiology, these spiders are able to convert the raw materials they consume into their threads, and rather than creating nests or webs with which to catch their prey, they utilize this byproduct to make 3D printers. Yes, you heard us right. SCP-4663 spiders use their web to make the housing and internal components of functioning 3D printers. Oh, and these printers are also alive. Referred to as SCP-4663-1, the printers created by these anomalous arachnids are separate living entities. In every physical detail, they resemble 3D printers, however do not match any of those that are commercially available for purchase. In terms of their functionality though, SCP-4663-1 instances do perform the same purpose as standard non-anomalous printers, and can be operated identically to traditional printers, although without the need for an STL file. However, a number of SCP-4663-1's components are known to portray them as living organisms. For example, the display screen present on each instance, which is known to be the anomalous printer's eyes. The power cord of each one functions as a tail and can be plugged into an electrical outlet. Doing so increases the efficiency of the printer by 3,000%. The extruder of an SCP-4663-1 functions as intestines for processing and then removing material, as well as providing the printers with a crude method of transport. The component that is responsible for spooling the filament is replaced by an organ much like a stomach, and can store significantly more material than SCP-4663-1 outwardly appears to be able to contain. Additionally, the printer's electrical input and output ports function as mouths. Oh yes, these printers need to be fed in order to work. Normally, it takes a colony of around 25 to 50,000 SCP-4663 instances to create one of these SCP-4663-1 printers. Once the spiders have constructed one of the printers, their next course of action will be to feed the newly constructed SCP-4663-1 instance. This will involve the spiders seeking out any nearby organic material and then depositing it in the mouths of an SCP-4663-1 instance. This can include plant life as well as other living organisms, which are digested and used to create the filament in order for an SCP-4663-1 instance to print. And what exactly do these anomalous printers print? More spiders, of course. This is how SCP-4663 is able to reproduce. As long as a continuous supply of biological matter is fed into an SCP-4663-1, the printer will continue creating new spiders at a rate of 1 every 2.5 minutes. These newly printed spiders will set about eating inorganic matter and creating a new 3D printer, which in turn will print out more spiders, leading the cycle to repeat itself. When presented with an otherwise ordinary 3D printer, the SCP-4663 spiders are also able to convert these standard non-anomalous devices into additional instances of SCP-4663-1. For a time, the SCP Foundation wasn't concerned about the behavior of these 3D printed spiders printing spider printers, keeping them housed in Type 2 containment terrariums. The researchers working on site had even seemingly found a practical application for SCP-4663: waste disposal. The spider colonies were being thrown trash from Foundation facilities, which the spiders would mostly consume, thus reducing the amount of garbage produced on site. However, despite being an unintentional mishap, this led to an incident on the 27th of June, 2018. Given the sheer amount of waste they'd been fed and thus used to make the thread to build 3D printers, one of the SCP-4663 colonies in Foundation containment had reached a population count of over 1 million spiders. Upon reaching this number, the anomalous spiders became frenzied and began pushing their numerous 3D printers toward each other. Once these SCP-4663-1s were close enough to each other, the spider colony began consuming their containment unit itself for raw materials. The printers were then able to create a much larger instance of SCP-4663, dubbed SCP-4663-2. This giant arachnid was over 9 feet in height and, upon its creation, promptly began to attempt an escape from Foundation containment. SCP-4663-2 seemingly acted as some form of leader for other instances of the anomalous spiders, or possibly even some kind of queen, given its ability to create 1,000 SCP-4663s in a single second. These newly created versions of the spiders were around 6 times larger than the average SCP-4663 instances, many of which were composed of varying combinations of inorganic and organic matter. This was owing to the fact that while traversing the Foundation facility housing it, SCP-4663-2 was also able to use any surrounding material it came into contact with in order to create these other spiders, as well as fashioning itself additional legs and more new SCP-4663-1 3D printers as well. Eventually, the larger SCP-4663-2 spider was captured. It had seemed to be heading towards a separate SCP-4663 colony in an apparent attempt to merge with them and add those spiders to its army. Following this breach, none of the SCP-4663 colonies that the Foundation keeps in containment are allowed to have a population bigger than 500,000. Now go check out SCP-5683, Will You Walk Into My Parlor, Set a Spider to a Fly, and SCP-3023, and then it decided to become an angry spider for more.